If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is James Harrington. I'm 42 years old, a Korean War veteran, and the Chief Ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I've spent most of my life out here in the wilderness, and if there's one thing I know, it's how to survive in the cold. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that winter in 1961. It was December, and the blizzards were worse than anything I'd ever seen. The snow came down so hard it felt like the sky was falling, and the temperatures dropped so low it could freeze a man's breath midair. Most of the park was abandoned for the season. Just a skeleton crew of researchers and rangers left behind to keep things running. I lived in a small cabin with my daughter, Rebecca. She was only 14, and it had been a tough year for us. My wife, her mother, had passed away from cancer just a few months earlier. I tried to stay strong for Rebecca, but every night when the wind howled through the trees, I couldn't help but feel like my wife was still out there, watching over us. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was something more. That morning, I got a call on the radio from one of the researchers stationed up in Lamar Valley. They were studying wolf reintroduction in the park and needed an emergency supply, delivery before the storm got any worse. I packed up some food, fuel, and medical supplies and headed out with Rebecca riding shotgun in my old snowcat. The drive was slow and eerie. The snow made everything look otherworldly. Trees bent under its weight, their branches like frozen arms reaching out to grab us. Rebecca sat quietly beside me, staring out the window. She'd been having these strange dreams lately. Visions of something she called the hungry man. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids have wild imaginations. But there was something about the way she described him that sent a chill down my spine. When we got to the research station, things felt off. The researchers seemed jumpy, like they hadn't slept in days. One of them, a young guy named Michael, mentioned that the wolves had been acting strange lately. They refused to enter certain valleys even though food was scarce this time of year. Another researcher said their radio equipment had been picking up weird sounds, static mixed with what sounded like whispers or chewing noises. As we unloaded the supplies, an unexpected visitor arrived. A woman named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. She introduced herself as an anthropologist studying indigenous legends in the area. She seemed out of place in her city clothes and thin gloves, but there was a quiet determination about her that made me take notice. Rebecca tugged on my sleeve as we were getting ready to leave. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's watching us." I followed her gaze toward the tree line, but all I saw were shadows dancing in the wind-blown snow. "It's just your imagination," I said, trying to reassure her, and myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few days were quiet, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's waiting just out of sight. The blizzard kept roaring outside, and the snow piled so high it covered the lower windows of our cabin. Rebecca stayed inside, drawing pictures to pass the time. She didn't talk much, but her drawings spoke for her. One morning, I noticed one of her sketches lying on the table. It was of a tall figure with stretched-out arms and legs, standing in the snow near a cabin that looked like ours. Its face was hollow, just a black hole where its eyes and mouth should have been. "Rebecca," I asked gently, "what is this?" She looked up at me, her face pale. "It's him," she said quietly. "The hungry man." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her it was just a bad dream, but something about the way she said it made my stomach turn. Later that day, I got another call from the research station. Michael had gone out to check some weather equipment near the edge of the valley and came back shaken. He said he'd heard his mother's voice calling to him from the woods. The problem was, his mother lived in Chicago, hundreds of miles away. When I arrived at the station to check on things, Michael showed me where he'd heard the voice. The snow there felt wrong. The air was colder than anywhere else in the park, and my breath hung heavy in front of me like smoke from a fire. I found tracks in the snow, long, thin footprints, but they ended abruptly as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. That evening, Rebecca woke up screaming from another nightmare. She clung to me, shaking like a leaf in the wind. "He's here," she cried. "He's watching us." I held her close and whispered that everything would be okay, but deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The storm outside only got worse. It was the kind of blizzard that swallowed sound, leaving nothing but the howl of the wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. The researchers at the station were on edge, and I couldn't blame them. Something wasn't right out here, and we all felt it. Then, Michael disappeared. It happened during a routine check of the weather equipment. He'd gone out with his jacket and snowshoes, promising to be back in 20 minutes. But an hour passed, and there was no sign of him. A search party was quickly organized. Me, Dr. Morrison, and 2 other researchers bundled up and headed into the storm. We found his jacket first, hanging from a tree about 20 feet up. There were no tracks leading to it, no sign of a struggle, just his coat flapping in the wind like some cruel flag. Dr. Morrison was quiet as she stared up at it, her face pale against the snow. "This isn't natural," she said softly, when we returned to the station empty-handed. Dr. Morrison finally told us why she was really here. She wasn't just studying indigenous legends for academic purposes. She was tracking a pattern of disappearances across northern parks over the last 50 years. Every 20 years or so, people would vanish during winter storms, leaving behind strange clues. Hollowed-out animal carcasses, footprints that stopped in the middle of nowhere, whispers on radios that couldn't be explained. "It's like something is hunting," she said grimly. That night, Rebecca's behavior changed again. She started eating more than usual. Huge portions that should have made her sick but didn't seem to fill her up. I caught her once in the kitchen, gnawing on a piece of raw meat like an animal. When I pulled it away from her, she looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm just so hungry." I didn't know what to do or say. I tried to convince myself it was just stress from everything going on, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, Thomas Running Wolf, a Blackfoot Park employee who had been helping out at the station, pulled me aside. He'd heard about what was happening with Rebecca and Michael's disappearance and decided it was time to tell me what he knew. "There's an old story my grandfather used to tell," he said in a low voice, "about a spirit that comes in winter when food is scarce, a spirit of hunger and cold." He paused for a moment before continuing. "We call it the wendigo." I'd heard stories about the wendigo before, tales of a creature that could mimic human voices and drive people mad with hunger, but I'd always thought they were just campfire stories meant to scare kids. Now I wasn't so sure. Thomas warned me that the wendigo didn't just kill its victims. It fed on their fear and desperation first, wearing them down until they were too weak to fight back. "Whatever this thing is," he said firmly, "it's not human anymore." The storm raged on, and by now it felt like the entire world had been swallowed by snow and ice. The radio crackled with static, and every now and then we'd hear strange noises coming through. Whispers, faint cries for help, and once what sounded like chewing. We were trapped. The supply helicopter that was supposed to bring more food and fuel had been diverted because of the storm. The researchers and I barricaded ourselves inside the station, trying to keep warm and keep calm. But the wendigo wasn't going to let us rest. That night, as the wind screamed outside, we heard a voice calling from the edge of the clearing. "Help me," it cried. "Please, it's so cold." It was Michael's voice. One of the researchers, Sarah, jumped up, her face pale. "That's him! He's alive!" she shouted, running toward the door. I grabbed her arm before she could open it. "No," I said firmly. "That's not Michael." She looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't let go. I knew in my gut that whatever was out there wasn't human. The voice kept calling, growing more desperate. "Sarah, please, help me." It sounded just like him, but there was something off about it, something too perfect, too rehearsed. Rebecca started sleepwalking that night. I woke up to find her standing by the window, staring out into the storm with her hand pressed against the glass. Her breath fogged up the pane as she whispered something I couldn't hear. "Rebecca," I said softly, touching her shoulder. She turned to me slowly, her eyes glassy and distant. "He's here," she murmured. "He wants me to come outside." I pulled her away from the window and held her close, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to get inside, not just into our cabin, but into our minds. The next morning, we found another deer carcass near the edge of the woods. Like before, it had been completely hollowed out, nothing left but skin stretched over brittle bones. There were no tracks leading to or from it. Dr. Morrison looked at me with a grim expression as we stood over the body. "It's playing with us," she said quietly. Thomas Running Wolf agreed. "It's testing us," he said, "wearing us down." The others were starting to crack under the pressure. Sarah wouldn't stop crying, and one of the younger researchers kept pacing back and forth, muttering to himself about how we were all going to die out here. I tried to keep everyone focused on survival, keeping the fire going, rationing supplies, but it was getting harder by the hour. The wendigo wasn't just out there in the storm, it was inside our heads now. By now, we were barely holding on. The cold had seeped into every corner of the station, and the fire in the stove seemed weaker with each passing hour. The wind outside sounded like a scream, and no one could sleep. Every creak of the building made us jump. Dr. Morrison had been poring over her notes, flipping through old books and papers she'd brought with her. She said there might be a way to protect ourselves, at least temporarily, but it wasn't going to be easy. Thomas Running Wolf agreed to help her. He said his family had passed down rituals to ward off spirits like the wendigo, though he admitted they were dangerous to perform and didn't always work. "It's better than doing nothing," he said. They spent hours carving symbols into the wooden beams of the station and sprinkling ash around the windows and doors. Rebecca watched them quietly, her hands clutching her sketchbook like it was a lifeline. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with me. For weeks now, I'd been dreaming about my wife, seeing her in the snow, hearing her voice calling to me during blizzards. At first, I thought it was just grief playing tricks on me, but now I wasn't so sure. Dr. Morrison pulled me aside while Thomas worked on the ritual. "James," she said gently, "I think it's targeting you." I frowned at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before answering. "The wendigo feeds on vulnerability, on fear, guilt, and loss. You've been dreaming about your wife because it knows you're grieving her." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was it possible? Had those dreams, those moments where I felt her presence, been nothing more than a trick? I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. That night, one of the younger researchers started acting strange. He'd been quiet, all day sitting in the corner and staring at nothing, but now he was pacing back and forth again, muttering under his breath. "I'm so hungry," he kept saying. "I can't take it anymore." We tried to calm him down, but he snapped at us like a wild animal. His nails had grown longer and sharper than they should have been, and his skin looked pale and stretched tight over his bones. Thomas grabbed him by the shoulders and shouted something in Blackfoot as Dr. Morrison held up one of her symbols. It seemed to work, for a moment, but then he lunged at us with an unnatural strength. We managed to restrain him, but it was clear what was happening. He was transforming. Rebecca stayed close to me as we locked him in one of the back rooms. Her eyes were wide with fear as she whispered, "Dad, I think it's going to happen to me too." The next few hours were chaos. The researcher we'd locked in the back room broke free. I don't know how. It was like he had strength beyond anything human. He tore through the door and lunged at us, his nails sharp like claws and his teeth bared. Thomas tried to stop him, shouting words from his ritual, but it wasn't enough. The researcher tackled one of the others, Sarah, and, before we could pull him off, it was too late. She screamed as he bit into her neck, and then she went silent. I grabbed the fire poker from the stove and swung it as hard as I could, knocking him backward. Dr. Morrison threw one of her symbols at him, and for a moment, he froze. His skin seemed to burn where the symbol touched him, and he let out a horrible scream before collapsing to the floor. Sarah was gone, and there was nothing we could do for her. The rest of us were shaken to the core. We'd lost one of our own, and now we knew for sure that whatever this thing was, it could turn people into monsters. Then the generator failed. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the weak flames in the stove, casting long shadows across the room. "Everyone stay close," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll figure this out." But even as I said it, I wasn't. Sure we would. 3 of the researchers decided they couldn't stay any longer. They grabbed their coats and said they were going to make a run for the emergency vehicle parked about half a mile away. I tried to stop them. I told them it wasn't safe, but they wouldn't listen. "We'll freeze if we stay here," one of them said. "At least out there we have a chance." I watched them disappear into the storm, their flashlights barely visible through the swirling snow. An hour later, Thomas found their bodies. They weren't whole anymore, just empty skin suits hanging from tree branches like decorations. Whatever had killed them hadn't left any tracks in the snow. Back at the station, Rebecca started acting strange again. She kept staring out the window like she was in a trance, her breath fogging up the glass as she whispered things I couldn't understand. Dr. Morrison stayed close to her while Thomas and I tried to reinforce the barricades around the building. But no matter how much wood we nailed over the windows or how many symbols we carved into the walls, it didn't feel like enough. Then it happened. The wendigo broke through. It smashed one of the windows during a whiteout storm, its long arms reaching inside like claws made of shadow and ice. We managed to push it back with fire and symbols, but not before it grabbed Dr. Morrison by the arm. She screamed as it pulled her toward the broken window, but she didn't fight back. Not really. Instead, she turned to me and said, "Take care of Rebecca." And then she was gone. After Dr. Morrison was taken, the station felt emptier than ever. The storm outside was relentless, and the wendigo wasn't just attacking us physically anymore. It was in our heads. Rebecca started having visions again. She told me she could see the creature in her dreams, walking through the snow, watching us from the trees. "It's waiting," she whispered one night as we huddled by the stove. "It's waiting for me." I didn't know what to do. My little girl was slipping away, and I felt powerless to stop it. The wendigo's voice came back that night, calling to us from outside the station. It used Dr. Morrison's voice this time, soft and pleading. "James, help me. Please." I clenched my fists trying to block it out, but Thomas wasn't so strong. He stood by the door, his hand hovering over the latch. "It's not her," I said sharply, grabbing his arm. "You know it's not her." He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The wendigo was wearing us down, breaking us apart piece by piece. It wasn't just the voices. It was everything. The cold seemed to seep into our bones no matter how close we stayed to the fire. The food we had left tasted like ash in our mouths, and no matter how much we ate, we never felt full. Rebecca grew quieter with each passing hour, her skin pale and her eyes distant. She started drawing again, sketches of the wendigo in horrifying detail. Its long limbs, its hollow face, its antler-like protrusions that seemed to grow out of its skull like twisted branches. "Rebecca," I said one evening as she worked, on another drawing, "how do you know what it looks like?" She didn't look up from her paper. "Because it shows me," she said simply. Thomas tried to keep our spirits up by telling stories about his family's battles with spirits like this one, how they'd fought them off with rituals and fire, how they'd survived against impossible odds. But even he was starting to lose hope. One night, as we sat in silence around the dying fire, Rebecca spoke up. "It's not just a monster," she said softly. "It used to be a person." We all turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "In my dreams, it showed me things. Memories, maybe." She shivered and pulled her blanket tighter around herself. "It was human once. A man who got lost in a storm like this one. He got so hungry, he ate someone." Thomas nodded grimly. "That's how it happens," he said. "The wendigo is born out of desperation, out of hunger so strong it turns a person into something else." I felt a chill run down my spine. That had nothing to do with the cold outside. We couldn't keep going like this. The wendigo was breaking us down, and if we didn't do something soon, none of us would make it out alive. Thomas and I stayed up late that night trying to come up with a plan. "It wants Rebecca," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. "It's drawn to her for some reason. If we can use that, maybe we can trap it." The thought of using my daughter as bait made my stomach turn, but I didn't see another way. The wendigo was too smart to walk into a trap unless we gave it something it wanted. "What do we need?" I asked. Thomas explained that the wendigo could only be harmed when it was fully manifested, when it took on a physical form. To do that, we'd have to lure it out into the open and weaken it with fire and symbols carved into the trees around a clearing. "We'll need Rebecca's help," he added reluctantly. "She has a connection to it. She can sense where it is." I hated the idea of putting her in danger, but Rebecca surprised me. When I told her about the plan, she nodded without hesitation. "I want to help," she said firmly. "If this thing is after me, I don't want to just sit here and wait for it." We spent the next day preparing. Thomas carved ancient symbols into the trees around a clearing not far from the station, while I gathered anything that could be used as a weapon: torches, flares, even bottles of fuel from the station's supply room. Rebecca stayed close to Thomas as he worked, her eyes scanning the woods like she could feel the wendigo watching us. "It's close," she whispered at one point, clutching my arm tightly. "It knows what we're doing." That night, as the storm howled around us, we set our trap. Rebecca stood in the center of the clearing with a lit torch in her hand while Thomas and I hid in the shadows with our makeshift weapons. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her stand there, so small and fragile against the vastness of the snow-covered forest. "Stay strong," I whispered to myself, gripping a flare tightly in my hand. The wind seemed to grow quieter all of a sudden, and for a moment, everything was still. Then we heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wendigo had arrived. The growl sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard before, low and guttural, like the earth itself was groaning. The trees around the clearing creaked as if they were bending under an invisible weight. Rebecca stood in the center of the clearing, clutching her torch. Her face was pale, but her hands didn't shake. She was braver than I could have ever imagined. Then it appeared. At first, it was just a shadow moving between the trees, too fast to follow, too big to be human. But then it stepped into the clearing, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The wendigo was taller than any man, its limbs impossibly long and thin like they'd been stretched. Its skin was gray and tight, clinging to its bones like it had been starved for centuries. Antler-like protrusions jutted from its skull, twisted and sharp, and its face. Its face was hollow, just two dark pits where its eyes should have been and a gaping hole where its mouth stretched unnaturally wide. It let out a sound, a horrible mix of a scream and a roar that made my knees feel weak. But Rebecca didn't flinch. She held her torch higher, the flames flickering in the wind. "Come on," she whispered under her breath, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she must have felt. The wendigo moved closer, its long legs carrying it across the snow without leaving a single track. It tilted its head as it stared at Rebecca, almost like it was curious. Then it stopped just a few feet away from her. That's when I saw it. Its face began to change. The hollow pits where its eyes should have been filled with something dark and swirling, and suddenly I wasn't looking at the wendigo anymore. I was looking at my wife. "James," it said in her voice, soft and familiar. "It's me." I froze. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. It looked just like her. The same kind eyes, the same gentle smile she used to give me when she thought no one else was watching. "Don't listen to it," Thomas shouted from behind me, snapping me out of my trance. "It's lying." But the creature kept talking, its voice sweet and warm like honey on a cold day. "James," it said again, stepping closer to me now instead of Rebecca. "You don't have to fight anymore. You can be with me. With us." For a moment, I wanted to believe it. I wanted to step forward and take her hand, to let go of all the pain and guilt I'd been carrying since she died. But then I looked at Rebecca, my daughter, standing there in the snow with tears streaming down her face, and I remembered what Dr. Morrison had said. The wendigo feeds on vulnerability. This wasn't my wife. This was a monster. "No," I said firmly, gripping the flare in my hand tighter. "You're not real." The creature let out another scream, angry this time, and lunged toward me with its long arms outstretched. "Now!" Thomas yelled. Rebecca dropped her torch onto the ground where we'd poured fuel earlier, and flames erupted around the clearing in an instant. The wendigo recoiled from the fire, its twisted body writhing as it let out an ear-piercing shriek. Thomas began chanting in his native language while Rebecca grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward safety. But the wendigo wasn't done yet. It turned toward Rebecca with those hollow eyes that seemed to see straight into your soul. "You can't stop me," it hissed in a voice that sounded like all our fears combined into one horrible sound. I knew what I had to do. I pushed Rebecca behind me and stepped forward with the flare in my hand. "You want someone?" I shouted at the creature. "Take me." The wendigo paused for a moment as if considering my offer. Then it lunged toward me again, but this time I was ready. I threw the flare directly at its chest as Thomas's chanting reached its peak. The flames caught instantly, spreading across its body like dry kindling. The creature screamed, a sound so loud and horrible that it felt like the earth itself was shaking, and then collapsed into the fire we'd set around the clearing. For a moment, everything was silent except for the crackle of flames and the howling wind. The fire burned bright against the snow, lighting up the clearing like a beacon in the storm. The wendigo's screams faded as its twisted body crumbled into ash and smoke, leaving nothing but silence behind. I fell to my knees, exhausted and shaking. Rebecca ran to me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders as tears streamed down her face. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you did it." I held her close, my heart pounding in my chest. "We did it," I said softly, brushing her hair back from her face. Thomas staggered toward us, clutching his side where blood seeped through his jacket. He'd been hurt during the ritual, but he was still standing, still alive. "It's gone," he said quietly, his voice heavy with relief. "For now." The storm began to ease as the wendigo's presence faded. The wind grew quieter and the snow stopped falling, leaving the forest eerily still. But something about the clearing felt wrong. The ground where the wendigo had burned was scorched black, and even as the snow melted around it, no plants would grow there again. When spring finally came, the park rangers filed an official report about what had happened, a tragic fire caused by a freak winter storm. They didn't mention the wendigo or the disappearances. No one would have believed them anyway. Rebecca and I left Yellowstone after that winter. She went to live with Thomas's family for a while. They understood what she'd been through better than anyone else could. But even as she tried to move on, she couldn't escape the visions. She told me that sometimes, during quiet nights, or heavy snowstorms, she could still see things, other creatures like the wendigo lurking in dark corners of the world. As for me, I stayed away from Yellowstone for years after that night, but every winter, when the blizzards rolled in and the wind howled through the trees, I couldn't help but think about what we'd faced out there in Lamar Valley. Sometimes, when I'm alone during a storm, I hear whispers carried on the wind, faint voices calling my name or begging for help, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear my wife's voice again. I don't know if it's real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But one thing is certain. There are things out there in the cold that we'll never fully understand. And every 20 years, when Rebecca returns to Yellowstone to place offerings at that cursed clearing, I wonder if one day it might come back. My name is Frank Holden. I'm 38 years old, a senior park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, and a man who's seen more than his fair share of darkness. I served in the Korean War, and though that chapter of my life ended years ago, it never really left me. Nightmares still haunt me, faces of men I couldn't save, the sound of gunfire and the cold, always the cold. It's why my wife left me. She said she couldn't take waking up to my screams anymore. I don't blame her. This January, the mountain was colder than I'd ever felt it before. The snow was relentless, piling higher every day, and temperatures plummeted to record lows, minus 30 degrees on some nights. The park was practically deserted for the winter except for a skeleton crew of rangers like me and a handful of military researchers stationed nearby. They were part of some Skywatcher program, scanning for Soviet planes or whatever it is. They do. I didn't ask too many questions. It wasn't my business. That week, I was leading a supply run to an isolated ranger station up near Sunrise Point. It was one of the most remote areas of the park, and with the blizzard conditions, it felt like we were heading straight into the heart of nowhere. My team consisted of Thomas, a junior ranger fresh out of college, Janet, a young scientist working with the military group, and 2 other researchers whose names I barely remembered because they mostly kept to themselves. The first thing I noticed, as we trekked deeper into the forest, was how quiet it was. Too quiet. Normally, even in winter, you'd hear something, birds chirping or the rustle of animals in the trees. But there was nothing, just the crunching of our boots in the snow and the wind howling through the pines. It put me on edge, right away. "Hey, Frank," Thomas said as we trudged along. "You ever seen weather like this before?" I shook my head. "Not like this," I replied. "Something about it feels off." Thomas laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's just Mother Nature having a bad day." I didn't laugh back. When we finally reached the station just before nightfall, we unloaded our supplies and settled in for what we thought would be a routine overnight stay before heading back down in the morning. The researchers were busy setting up their equipment to monitor atmospheric readings or whatever it was they were studying, while Thomas and I checked on the station's generator and made sure everything was in working order. That's when I noticed it. The silence again. No wind this time, no creaking trees, just complete stillness. It felt like the whole world had stopped holding its breath. "Frank," Janet called from outside, "you need to see this." I stepped out into the freezing air and followed her around to the back of the station where she pointed at something in the snow. At first glance, it looked like footprints, long and narrow, but they weren't human or animal. They were something else entirely. "What kind of tracks are those?" Thomas asked as he joined us. "I don't know," I said honestly, crouching down to get a closer look. The tracks stretched for about 20 feet before disappearing into thin air. No sign of where they came from or where they went. Just gone. "That doesn't make any sense," Janet muttered. "Nothing about this place makes sense right now," I replied quietly. That night, as we sat around, the small wood stove trying to stay warm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from out there in the dark forest beyond our station walls. Something unnatural. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching noise coming from somewhere outside the station. At first, I thought it might be the wind blowing, branches against the walls, but when I stepped out into the bitter cold to check, there was nothing there, just snow and silence. Thomas joined me a few minutes later, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "What's going on?" he asked. "Not sure," I said, scanning the tree line. "Did you hear anything last night?" He shook his head. "No, but—" "I don't know, Frank. Something doesn't feel right." I didn't say anything, but I agreed with him. There was something about this place, about the way the air felt heavy and the way the snow seemed to fall slower than usual, that made my skin crawl. Later that day, while Thomas and Janet were out checking the perimeter, they found something that made things even stranger. It was an animal, a deer, but it wasn't just dead. Its organs had been removed cleanly, like someone had performed surgery on it. There was no blood anywhere around the body, no signs of a struggle, just emptiness. Janet's face went pale as she stared at it. "What could do something like this?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, though my gut told me otherwise. Thomas looked shaken too, but he tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh. "Maybe it's some kind of predator we don't know about." "Predators don't do this," Janet replied sharply. We dragged the deer's body back to the station so Janet could examine it more closely with her equipment. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints we'd found yesterday. The ones that disappeared into thin air, and how they might be connected to this. That night, things got worse. It started with Thomas hearing something outside while he was on patrol near the edge of the forest. He said he heard his girlfriend's voice calling his name, soft at first, then louder and more desperate. "Frank!" he shouted as he ran back into the station. "She's out there! I swear I heard her!" I grabbed him by the shoulders and forced him to look at me. "Thomas," I said firmly, "your girlfriend is back in Seattle. She's not here." "But—" He started to argue before stopping himself. His face twisted in confusion and fear as he realized how impossible his claim was. "It wasn't her," I said quietly. "Whatever you heard, it wasn't real." We stayed inside after that, locking every door and window as if that would somehow keep us safe from whatever was out there. The researchers didn't argue. They were just as spooked as we were. At one point during the night, our radio picked up something strange. Voices speaking backwards. It wasn't static or interference. It was clear enough that we could hear, words being repeated over and over again in reverse. Janet tried to record it, but before she could hit play again, the signal cut out completely. By now, even the researchers were starting to panic. One of them, a man named Dr. Harris, kept pacing back and forth muttering about how none of this made sense scientifically. "It's just the storm messing with us," he said over and over again like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But deep down, we all knew this wasn't just a storm. The next morning, Thomas was gone. I woke up early, as I always do, and noticed his bunk was empty. At first, I thought maybe he'd gone outside to check the perimeter again, but when I called out for him, there was no answer. Janet and the researchers joined me as we searched the area around the station. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was strong enough to sting our faces, but we kept looking. That's when we found his flashlight. It was lying in the snow near the tree line, flickering weakly. But there were no footprints leading away from it, just a single set of tracks that stopped abruptly, like he'd been plucked out of thin air. Janet looked at me with wide eyes. "Frank, what's happening?" "I don't know," I said, honestly, though my stomach churned with dread. We didn't find any other signs of Thomas that day. It was like he'd vanished into the storm. By nightfall, the researchers were on edge, more than usual. Dr. Harris kept pacing again, muttering about how none of this made sense scientifically. His colleague, Dr. Patel, tried to calm him down, but she looked just as scared as he did. That night, something happened that none of us could explain. One of the researchers, Dr. Harris, was found frozen solid outside the station. He was standing upright in a running position, his face twisted, in terror like he'd been fleeing from something. But here's the thing. It wasn't cold enough for someone to freeze that fast, not even at -30 degrees. Janet screamed when she saw him. I couldn't blame her. It was one of the most horrifying things I'd ever seen. And I've seen plenty. We dragged his body inside and covered it with a blanket, but it didn't make us feel any safer. If anything, it made things worse because now we knew whatever was out there could get to us, even if we stayed inside. Later that night, while Janet and I were sitting by the stove trying to stay warm, I told her about something I'd seen earlier, in the day while searching for Thomas. It was a cave, a small one tucked away near a rocky outcrop not far from the station. Inside were ancient pictographs carved into the stone, images of an emaciated figure with long limbs and antlers. "What do you think it means?" Janet asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it has something to do with what's happening here." She nodded slowly, her face pale and drawn. "Do you think Thomas is still alive?" I didn't answer right away because deep down, I already knew the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Not yet. That night, as we sat in silence watching the fire crackle in the stove, I started seeing things, or at least I thought I did. At first, it was just shadows moving at the edges of my vision. Then, it was my brother. He stood near the doorway, staring at me with empty eyes like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I blinked hard, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But when I looked again, he was gone. By the next evening, the storm had worsened. The wind howled like a living thing, slamming against the station walls, and the snow piled so high it covered the lower windows. We were trapped. The thought of venturing outside was unthinkable, not just because of the weather, but because of whatever was out there. We tried to keep busy to distract ourselves. Janet worked on her notes, Dr. Patel tinkered with the radio, and I double-checked every lock and barricade in the station. But no matter what we did, the tension hung in the air like a weight pressing down on all of us. That's when we heard it. "Help me," a voice called from outside. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder and more desperate. "Please, someone help me." Janet froze, her pen dropping from her hand. "Is that Thomas?" I grabbed my coat and flashlight ready to rush outside, but something stopped me. The voice. It sounded like Thomas, but there was something off about it. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Frank," Janet said, her voice trembling. "You don't think it's really him, do you?" I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. "No," I said finally. "It's not him." The voice kept calling out, repeating the same words over and over again like a broken record. "Help me! Please! Someone help me!" It was coming from somewhere deep in the forest, far beyond where Thomas could have gone. Dr. Patel stood up, suddenly, her face pale. "What if he's hurt? What if—" "It's not him," I interrupted firmly. "Whatever's out there, it's trying to lure us out." She didn't argue after that. The voice eventually stopped, but none of us could relax. Janet sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out into the storm like she was expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment. Later that night, we discovered something even worse. I went up to check the attic for extra blankets and supplies when I noticed a strange smell, something metallic and sickly sweet. My stomach churned as I followed it to a corner of the attic where an old storage trunk sat covered in dust. When I opened it, I found Thomas, or what was left of him. His body was half-eaten, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. I stumbled back, barely able to keep myself from vomiting as the reality of what I was seeing sank in. I climbed back down to tell Janet and Dr. Patel what I'd found. Janet burst into tears while Dr. Patel just sat there in stunned silence, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. "We're not dealing with an animal," I said finally. This is something else. What do we do? Janet whispered through her tears. We stay inside, I said firmly. We don't open that door for anything or anyone. But deep down, I wasn't sure how much longer we could hold out. The night dragged on like it would never end. The storm outside was relentless, and the cold seeped into every corner of the station no matter how high we turned up the heat. Janet sat curled up by the stove, her face pale and her hands trembling. Dr. Patel hadn't said a word since I told them about Thomas. She just stared at the floor, gripping her notebook like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I couldn't sit still. My instincts told me that whatever was out there wasn't going to wait much longer. It was stalking us, testing us, and sooner or later it would make its move. That's when I remembered something. Something the tribal elder had told me years ago when I first started working in the park. He'd warned me about a spirit that walked in the winter, a creature born from starvation and desperation. He called it the wendigo. I didn't believe him back then. I thought it was just a story meant to scare kids or keep people from wandering too far into the woods during bad weather. But now I wasn't so sure. Janet, I said, breaking the silence, do you know anything about creatures like this? Something that mimics voices or causes hallucinations? She looked up at me, her eyes red from crying. I've read about things like that, she said hesitantly. There are legends, old ones, about spirits that prey on people during harsh winters. They're connected to starvation, cannibalism. Dr. Patel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You think that's what's happening here? I nodded slowly. I don't know what else it could be. Janet wiped her face and sat up straighter, trying to pull herself together. If it's connected to starvation, maybe that's its weakness. What do you mean? I asked. She hesitated before answering. If it feeds on desperation or fear, maybe we can fight back by staying strong, by not giving it what it wants. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. As we talked, I noticed something strange outside the window. Ice formations were starting to appear around the station. Long, jagged spikes that seemed to grow out of the ground like claws reaching for us. They weren't natural. I knew that much right away. It's closing in, I said grimly. Janet grabbed my arm suddenly, her eyes wide with realization. Frank, you've been through worse than this, haven't you? The war. I nodded slowly, unsure of where she was going with this. That's why you're not affected like Thomas was, she said urgently. You've already faced your worst fears. You've already survived them. Her words hit me harder than I expected because deep down, I knew she was right. The nightmares that haunted me every night, the memories of my brother dying in combat, they were worse than anything this creature could throw at me. But surviving wasn't enough anymore. We needed to fight back. By the time dawn should have come, the storm had swallowed everything. The sky was dark, the wind screamed louder than ever, and the station felt like a coffin. The ice formations outside had grown taller, creeping closer to the walls, and the temperature inside was dropping fast. We were running out of time. That's when it came. At first, we heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches in the snow. Then came the voice. This time, it wasn't Thomas. It was my brother. Frank. The voice called softly from outside. It's me. I need your help. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I knew it wasn't real. I knew my brother was dead, but hearing his voice again after all these years was like a knife to the chest. Frank, Janet said, snapping me out of it. Don't listen. I nodded, forcing myself to focus. Stay here, I told her and Dr. Patel. No matter what happens, don't open that door. What are you going to do? Janet asked, her voice trembling. I'm going to end this, I said, grabbing my pack and my brother's old compass, the one I always carried with me. It felt heavy in my hand, like it understood what I was about to do. Before they could argue, I opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing the air from my lungs and biting through my coat. The snow was so thick I could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but I didn't need to see. I could feel it. Feel him watching me. "Frank," the voice called again, closer this time. "Why did you leave me?" My hands shook as I gripped the flare gun in my pocket. "You're not real," I muttered under my breath. "You're not real." I followed the sound of the voice up the mountain, away from the station. The wind seemed to push against me with every step, like it was trying to keep me from moving forward. But I kept going. I had to. Then I saw it. The Wendigo stood at the edge of a clearing, its tall, emaciated frame silhouetted against the swirling snow. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its antlers gleamed like ice in the faint light of my flashlight. But what struck me most were its eyes, empty and black, yet somehow filled with hunger. It didn't attack right away. Instead, it just stood there watching me, tilting its head like it was curious. "You're not going to win," I said aloud, though my voice shook with fear. The creature let out a low growl that sounded almost like laughter before lunging toward me with terrifying speed. I fired the flare gun without thinking, and the bright red light exploded in front of it, forcing it to stop and recoil. Fire. It hated fire. I used that moment to run toward an old fire lookout tower not far from where we were standing. It was abandoned years ago but still sturdy enough to climb into for shelter. Or so I hoped. The Wendigo followed close behind, its growls growing louder as it closed the distance between us. My legs burned as I scrambled up the tower's ladder and into the small room at the top. Once inside, I turned and aimed another flare at the creature as it started climbing after me. The second flare hit its shoulder, and it let out an ear-piercing scream that made my ears ring. But it didn't stop. It kept coming. I knew then that there was only one way to end this. I grabbed 2 emergency propane tanks stored in the corner of the lookout and set them near the entrance where the creature would come through. Then I pulled out my last flare and held it tightly in my hand. As soon as the Wendigo's face appeared at the edge of the platform, I lit the flare and tossed it onto the tanks. The explosion was deafening. The force of it threw me backward against the wall as flames engulfed everything around me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the Wendigo's silhouette consumed by fire as its screams echoed through the storm. When I woke, up hours later, or maybe days, I was lying in a snowdrift at the base of what used to be the fire lookout tower. The structure was gone, reduced to charred wood and ash scattered across the mountainside. I didn't know how I survived or how far I'd been thrown by the blast, but somehow I was alive. The Wendigo wasn't. When rescuers finally found me. Weeks later, after the storm cleared, they said they'd seen an explosion from miles away but assumed it was part of a military test nearby. They didn't believe a word of what I told them about what really happened. Not that I blamed them, but Janet did. She found my journal buried in what remained of our station, the one where I'd written down everything we'd seen and experienced during those long days on Mount Rainier. She promised she'd make sure people knew what happened, even if no one believed her either. As for me, well, some nights when winter comes early and snow blankets everything in silence, I swear I can still hear its voice calling my name from somewhere deep in those dark woods. My name is Eleanor Harmon, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 31 years old and I'm the first female ranger in my district here in Washington. It's not exactly a title I brag about. Being the first just means there's a lot of people waiting for you to fail. But I didn't take this job to prove anything to anyone. I took it because I needed to be here, in these woods. The rainforest. I've been here before, a long time ago, when I was just a teenager. My brother Sam and I used to explore these woods together, until the day he disappeared. We were hiking, just like we always did. But one second he was there, and the next, gone. No one ever found him. Not a trace. and I've carried that guilt with me every single day since. That's why I came back. To protect this forest, yes, but also to find some kind of closure, maybe even answers. It was October, peak fog season, and the air felt heavy with moisture as I stood at the edge of the forest. The trees here are ancient, massive giants that tower over everything else, and the moss drapes over them like green curtains. It's beautiful, but it's also unsettling. There's a silence here that doesn't feel natural, like the forest is holding its breath. I wasn't alone on this trip. My team included Marcus, a young research assistant who was eager but maybe a little too green for this kind of work, Dr. Clara Nguyen, an ecologist who had seen it all and wasn't easily rattled, and Jonah, our local guide. Jonah was quiet, too quiet, and he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out at us. Our mission seemed simple enough. Investigate reports of strange fungal blooms that had appeared after some heavy rainstorms in the area. Fungi are my specialty. I used to be a biology professor before I left academia, but even I wasn't prepared for what we found. We set up camp near an ancient grove of trees that looked like they belonged in another world. Their trunks were massive, their roots twisting out of the ground like veins, and their branches reached so high they disappeared into the mist. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Jonah finally spoke up. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before answering. "This place, it's not right. My people call it the land of the Watchers." "The Watchers?" Marcus asked, leaning forward. Jonah didn't answer. He just stared into the fire like he wished he were anywhere else. Later that night, as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from deep within the forest. It wasn't firelight or moonlight. It was something else entirely. It flickered softly like tiny lanterns swaying in the mist. The next morning, things got even stranger. We found small animals near our camp, rabbits and squirrels, that had these weird fungal growths sprouting from their bodies. They didn't look natural, they looked wrong. Clara tried to explain it away as some kind of fungal infection caused by all the moisture in the air, but I wasn't so sure. And then there were the footprints. Massive footprints pressed deep into the mud near our camp. They were too big to belong to any human or animal I'd ever seen. That's when I started to feel it, the sense that we weren't alone out here. Something was watching us. The next few days were strange. At first, it was little things you could brush off if you weren't paying close attention. Marcus started acting weird. He was usually chatty, always asking questions or cracking jokes, but now he was quiet. Too quiet. He kept staring at the trees like they were moving, but every time I asked him what was wrong, he'd just shake his head and mumble something about being tired. Then there was the footprint we found. It was massive, at least twice the size of a human foot, and it had this strange texture to it, like the skin wasn't smooth but covered in tiny ridges. Marcus took pictures, but when we tried to look at them later, the images were blurry, like the camera couldn't focus properly. Jonah refused to go near certain parts of the forest. He didn't explain why. He just said it wasn't safe. "This valley," he muttered one morning as we packed up our gear. "It's not for us." "What do you mean?" I asked him. He looked at me, his face pale. "My people don't go there. Not ever." I wanted to push him for more answers, but something in his voice stopped me. He sounded scared, really scared, and Jonah wasn't the kind of guy who scared easily. That night, things got worse. Marcus woke me up in the middle of the night, shaking my tent like his life depended on it. "Ellie," he hissed, "you have to see this." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and followed him into the misty darkness. He pointed toward the tree line, his hand shaking. "Look," he whispered. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and fog and shadows. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of our camp. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape looked wrong. like a person, but not quite. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Is that?" I started to say, but Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward camp. "We shouldn't be out here," he said quickly. "We need to go back." The next morning, Marcus didn't remember waking me up or seeing anything near the camp. When I tried to remind him, he looked at me like I was crazy. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly. That's when I started noticing something else. Time felt strange here. Sometimes it felt like hours passed in minutes. Other times it felt like minutes stretched into hours. Jonah said it was just the fog messing with our heads, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The final straw came when we found a wildlife camera we'd set up near one of the fungal blooms. The camera had captured something moving through the trees, but when we played back the footage, all we could see was a blurry shape that seemed to melt into the shadows. Clara tried to stay calm and logical about everything that was happening, but even she couldn't explain what we were seeing or feeling in this forest. By now, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched everywhere we went. The trees seemed closer somehow, like they were leaning in toward us when we weren't looking. And every time I turned around quickly enough to catch them, they were still. But I knew better than to trust my eyes out here. The forest was changing. Or maybe it was us. Either way, something wasn't right. It started with Marcus. He disappeared one afternoon while we were collecting samples near the grove. He'd wandered off to check a nearby stream, but when he didn't come back after half an hour, I went looking for him. I found him 2 days later. He was lying on the ground, curled up like a child. His clothes were damp and his skin was pale, almost gray. But the worst part was the spores. Tiny, glowing fungal spores covering his arms and neck like a second skin. When I shook him awake, he stared at me with glassy eyes and said, "They showed me the truth." "What truth?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just stared past me into the trees. We brought him back to camp, but Marcus wasn't the same. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words didn't make sense. Something about roots and networks and how everything is connected. Clara tried to examine him, but every time she touched his skin, the spores seemed to pulse like they were alive. That night, our equipment started acting strange. The wildlife cameras we'd set up near the grove stopped working entirely. Our radios crackled with static no matter how much we adjusted them. Even our flashlights flickered like their batteries were dying, except they were brand new. And then, there were the trees. I swear they were moving. Not fast enough to see it happen, but fast enough that you noticed when you turned around and looked again. A tree that had been 20 feet away suddenly felt like it was 10 feet closer. Jonah refused to sleep that night. He just sat by the fire with his knife in his hand, muttering prayers under his breath. The next morning, we found something that made my stomach turn. A cave hidden behind a wall of moss and roots. It wasn't on any map we'd brought with us, and Jonah swore it hadn't been there before. Inside the cave were petroglyphs, ancient carvings etched into the stone walls. They showed figures that looked human at first glance but weren't quite right. Their bodies seemed to merge with trees and mushrooms, their limbs twisting into roots and branches. "This isn't normal," Clara said quietly as she traced one of the carvings with her fingers. "No kidding," I muttered. Marcus wandered into the cave while we were examining the walls. He stood in front of one of the carvings for what felt like forever before turning to me with wide eyes. "They're not gone," he whispered. "They're just waiting." "Who's waiting?" I asked him. "The Watchers," he said simply. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing just outside my tent, watching me through the thin fabric walls. And when I finally worked up the courage to peek outside, there was nothing there. But I knew better than to believe that. By now, I was sure of one thing. We weren't alone in this forest. Something was out there, watching us, waiting, and whatever it was, it didn't want us here. Marcus was getting worse. The spores on his skin had spread, glowing faintly in the dark like tiny stars. He started wandering off at night, mumbling to himself in a language none of us recognized. Clara tried to keep him close, but it was like he wasn't even Marcus anymore, like the forest had taken him and left something else behind. It wasn't just him, though. The forest itself felt alive. Paths we'd walked dozens of times suddenly led us back to where we started, no matter how carefully we tried to follow them. The trees seemed to shift when we weren't looking, their roots twisting into shapes that looked almost human. And then we saw them. It was just before sunset when Jonah spotted the first one, a tall figure standing at the edge of the grove, half hidden by the mist. At first, I thought it was just another tree stump, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. It stepped closer to us, and I realized it wasn't human. It was too tall, its limbs too long and covered in fur that seemed to shimmer faintly in the fading light. "Don't move," Jonah whispered. We froze as more figures appeared around us, silent and still, like statues carved from wood and shadow. They didn't make a sound, but I could feel their presence pressing down on me like a weight. "They're warning us," Jonah said quietly. "Warning us about what?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Jonah didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on his knife and started backing away. That night, our camp became a maze. Every time we tried to leave the grove, we ended up right back where we started. It didn't matter which direction we went or how carefully we marked our path, the forest wouldn't let us go. The Sasquatch creatures stayed just out of sight watching us from the shadows. I could feel their eyes on me every time I turned around, but they never got close enough for me to see them clearly. Marcus disappeared again that night. When we found him the next morning, he was standing in the middle of the grove with his arms outstretched like he was trying to embrace the trees. His body was covered in glowing fungal growths that pulsed rhythmically with each breath he took. "They're calling me," he said softly when I tried to pull him away. "Who's calling you?" I asked desperately. "The network," he whispered. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The Sasquatch creatures were getting closer now, circling our camp like predators stalking their prey. Clara tried to radio for help again, but all she got was static. Even our flashlights were useless now. Their beams barely cut through the mist before flickering out entirely. "We need to get out of here," Jonah said firmly. "How?" I asked him. "The forest won't let us leave." Jonah hesitated before answering. "There's one way." "What is it?" Clara asked quickly. "Fire." Jonah's idea of using fire felt like a last resort, but at this point, it was the only plan we had. The forest was closing in on us, and the Sasquatch creatures weren't going to let us leave without a fight. I didn't want to hurt the forest. I'd come here to protect it. But if fire was the only way to disrupt whatever was controlling this place, then we didn't have a choice. Before we could act, Marcus took another turn for the worse. His skin was almost completely covered in glowing fungal growths now, and his eyes looked hollow, like he wasn't really there anymore. He started speaking in that strange language again, his voice low and guttural. It didn't sound human. Then, he walked straight into the forest. "Marcus!" I shouted, running after him. Jonah grabbed my arm and pulled me back. "You can't follow him," he said firmly. "He's part of it now," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. Marcus wasn't Marcus anymore. The forest had taken him. As we stood there trying to figure out what to do next, I noticed something strange near the edge of the grove. A backpack tangled in a mass of roots and fungi. It was old and weathered, but I recognized it immediately. It was Sam's backpack. My heart stopped. I ran toward it, ignoring Jonah's warnings to stay back. When I reached the backpack, I saw that it was almost perfectly preserved, as if the forest had been keeping it safe all these years. But what really shook me was what I found inside. A photograph of Sam and me from when we were kids. He'd been carrying it with him when he disappeared. Tears filled my eyes as I clutched the photo in my hands. Sam, I whispered. The Sasquatch. Creatures were closer now, close enough that I could see their glowing fungal growths blending into the trees around them. They weren't just part of the forest. They were the forest. And somehow, Sam had become part of it too. That's when the logging company's armed team showed up. They'd been sent to clear us out after Jonah reported what was happening here. At first, I thought they might help us escape, but it quickly became clear that they had no idea what they were walking into. They didn't listen when we tried to warn them about the creatures or the spores. They just charged into the grove with their weapons drawn. It didn't take long for them to realize their mistake. The spores spread faster than I'd ever seen before, infecting anyone who got too close to the creatures or their fungal network. The armed team barely lasted 5 minutes before they started turning, glowing fungal growths spreading across their bodies as they dropped their weapons and wandered into the forest like Marcus had. "We have to go," Jonah said urgently. "How?" Clara asked desperately. "We're trapped." I remembered what Jonah had said about fire disrupting the fungal network's communication. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wouldn't destroy the creatures or stop whatever was controlling them, but it might give us enough time to escape. Using some of our remaining supplies, we rigged together a makeshift torch and set fire to one of the smaller fungal blooms near our camp. The flames spread quickly, eating away at the glowing spores and creating a small gap in the network's control over the forest paths. It worked, at least for now. "Run!" Jonah shouted as he grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the opening in the grove. I hesitated for a moment, looking back at Marcus and Sam's backpack one last time before following them into the misty darkness. We ran as fast as we could, the fire crackling behind us and the mist swallowing everything. Ahead, the forest didn't feel like a forest anymore. It felt alive, like it was shifting and moving to trap us. The trees leaned in closer, their roots twisting across the ground like they were trying to grab us. I could hear the Sasquatch creatures, moving through the fog, their heavy footsteps echoing all around. Jonah led the way, his knife in one hand and the makeshift torch in the other. Clara was right behind him, stumbling over roots and rocks but refusing to stop. I followed them, clutching Sam's backpack tightly against my chest like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Then I saw him. Sam. He stepped out of the mist, his body half covered in glowing fungal growths. His face was still human enough for me to recognize him, but his eyes were different. They glowed faintly like the spores had taken root inside him. "Ellie," he said softly. I froze. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. "Sam," I whispered. Jonah grabbed my arm and tried to pull me forward. "Don't stop," he shouted, but I couldn't move. Not yet. "Ellie," Sam said again, stepping closer, "you have to go." "I can't leave you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You already did," he said quietly. "A long time ago." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I'd never stopped looking for him, but there wasn't time. The Sasquatch creatures were closing in around us, their glowing fungal growths blending into the mist until it felt like the forest itself was alive. Sam reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was cold, but it wasn't threatening. It was comforting, like he was trying to protect me. "I'll help you," he said softly. Before I could respond, Sam turned toward the creatures and raised his arms like he was commanding them. The fungal growths on his body pulsed brightly for a moment before dimming again, and the creatures hesitated, just long enough for Jonah and Clara to pull me away. "Run!" Jonah shouted again. I didn't want to leave Sam behind, but I knew there was no other choice. He wasn't coming with us, not as himself anyway, and if we stayed any longer, none of us would make it out alive. We ran through the valley, following Jonah's lead as he used the torch to clear a path through the glowing fungal blooms. The Sasquatch creatures didn't follow us this time. They just stood there, watching silently as we disappeared into the mist. When we finally broke through the edge of the forest and into open ground, I collapsed onto my knees, gasping for air. Clara sat beside me, her face pale and her hands shaking. Jonah didn't say anything. He just stared back at the forest with a look of quiet determination. That night, as we waited for help to arrive, we saw smoke rising from deep within the forest. The logging company's operation had mysteriously burned down. Whether it was an accident or something else entirely, we never found out. The days that followed were a blur. We gave our reports to local authorities and environmental agencies, but no one believed us. Not about Marcus or Sam or the Sasquatch creatures or the fungal network controlling everything in that forest. They chalked it up to stress and exhaustion and buried our findings under layers of bureaucracy. I lost my job after that, discredited professionally for what they called wild claims. But I didn't care about that anymore. What mattered was protecting that forest from anyone who might try to exploit it again. I stayed in Washington after everything happened and dedicated my life to environmental activism. The restricted zone around the Hoh rainforest expanded under mysterious circumstances not long after our expedition ended, and no one's been allowed near that grove since. Sometimes I leave offerings at the edge of the forest, flowers or photographs or little trinkets Sam used to love, and every now and then, I swear I see something watching from deep within the trees. I don't know if it's Sam or one of those creatures or just my imagination playing tricks on me again, but whoever, or whatever, it is. I hope they know that I haven't forgotten them, and I never will. My name is Marcus Wilson, and for most of my life, I've been chasing danger. I served as a Marine for 8 years, seen things that would keep most people awake at night, and somehow made it out alive. After leaving the military, I thought I'd settle down, find something quieter, safer. That's how I ended up here, working as a park ranger in Okefenokee Swamp. But quiet? Safe? Turns out this place is anything but. Okefenokee Swamp isn't just your average swamp. It's massive, stretching for miles, with trees so tall they block out the sun. The air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you, and the smell of mud and decay never really goes away. Locals say the swamp has a soul of its own, a dark one. They talk about something called the Mist Walker, a shadowy figure that appears in the fog when the swamp wants to keep you out. At first, I thought, it was just stories to scare tourists. But now I'm not so sure. I wasn't alone in the swamp this time. A research team had come down to study the effects of the recent drought on wildlife. There was Dr. Elaine Foster, a biologist who seemed to know everything about ecosystems, Robert Turner, her assistant, Patricia Garcia, a historian who specialized in indigenous cultures, Cameron Hayes, a photographer who was way too excited about being here, and Jackson Thompson, our guide, a local who knew the swamp like the back of his hand. From the moment we stepped into the swamp that morning, something felt off. The heat was unbearable even for Georgia in summer. The water levels were so low, the parts of the swamp looked like a desert instead of wetlands. And then there was the mist, thick and unnatural, swirling around us even though there wasn't any wind. Jackson was the first to notice it. "This ain't right," he muttered, under his breath. He didn't say much else after that, but kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out at us. We walked deeper into the swamp, following Jackson's lead while Patricia explained some of its history. She talked about how indigenous tribes used to live here long ago and believed the swamp was sacred, a place where spirits roamed freely. She mentioned burial mounds hidden deep in the swamp and how disturbing them was considered a terrible curse. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, I'd dealt with worse things than spooky stories during my time in the Marines. But as we moved further into the swamp and the mist grew thicker, I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut, like we weren't supposed to be here. That's when we heard it. a sound like someone whispering just out of earshot. It came from all around us, soft at first but growing louder with every step we took. Jackson froze in his tracks and turned to look at me. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yeah." Elaine tried to brush it off as wind moving, through the trees, but there wasn't any wind, not even a breeze. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they started, leaving an eerie silence behind them. None of us said anything after that. We just kept walking. By the time we reached our campsite near one of the larger ponds in the swamp, everyone seemed on edge. Even Cameron, who'd been snapping pictures nonstop earlier but now barely touched his camera. As night fell and we set up our tents, Jackson pulled me aside. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I don't know what's going on out here, but I've lived near this swamp my whole life, and I've never seen it act like this." "What do you mean?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "The mist. It's thicker than usual. Animals are quiet when they should be loud at night. And that sound earlier, that wasn't no wind." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that it was just nerves or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew he was right. That night, as I lay in my tent trying to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about what Jackson had said, or about those whispers we'd heard earlier. And then came the dream, the one that changed everything. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. It felt so real that when I woke up, I wasn't sure where the dream ended and reality began. In the dream, I was standing in the middle of the swamp. The mist was so thick I couldn't see my own hands in front of me. Then, out of nowhere, I heard drums, low and steady like a heartbeat. Shadows moved through the fog, their shapes twisting and stretching like they weren't human. And then I saw them. Figures painted in red and black, their faces blank but their eyes glowing like embers. They were chanting something I couldn't understand. One of them stepped forward and pointed at me with a long, bony finger. The chanting stopped, and everything went silent. That's when I woke up, gasping for air and covered in sweat. I sat up in my tent and tried to shake it off. "Just a dream," I whispered to myself. But it didn't feel like just a dream. The next morning, everyone looked like they hadn't slept much either. Jackson had dark circles under his eyes, and even Cameron seemed quieter than usual. As we packed up our gear to move deeper into the swamp, Patricia noticed something strange. Near the edge of our campsite, a set of footprints in the mud. "Did any of you walk out here last night?" she asked, crouching down to get a closer look. We all shook our heads. The prints were large, too large to belong to any of us, and they had an odd shape, almost like claws instead of toes. "Maybe it's a gator," Elaine suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Jackson frowned as he studied the tracks. "Gators don't leave prints like this," he muttered under his breath. He didn't say anything else after that, but kept glancing over his shoulder as we continued on our way. As we hiked further into the swamp, things only got stranger. Cameron's camera stopped working out of nowhere. One minute it was fine, and the next it was completely dead. "That's weird," he said, fiddling with the buttons. "I just charged this thing last night." Then Elaine's GPS started acting up too. It kept losing signal even though we weren't far enough out for that to happen. "It's probably just interference from the trees," she said, but her voice had an edge to it that made me think. She didn't believe her own explanation. By midday, we reached an area Patricia had been eager to explore. A cluster of stones arranged in a circle near what looked like an old burial mound. The stones were covered in strange carvings that none of us could read except Patricia. "These are creek symbols," she said excitedly as she ran her fingers over one of the stones. "They used to perform rituals here, ceremonies to honor their ancestors and protect the land." "Protect it from what?" Cameron asked as he snapped pictures with his backup camera. Patricia hesitated before answering. "From spirits, or so they believed." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. No one said anything after that. We just stood there staring at those stones until Jackson finally broke the silence. "We should keep moving," he said firmly. As we walked away from the site, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched, not by an animal or another person, but by something else entirely. That night at camp, things got worse. It started with small noises, branches snapping in the distance and rustling in the bushes, but soon those noises turned into whispers again. They were faint at first, but grew louder as the night went on until it sounded like they were coming from right outside our tents. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the darkness to take a look around. The mist had rolled in again, thicker than ever before, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. "Jackson," I called out softly. No answer. "Elaine, Patricia, Cameron." Still nothing, and then I saw it. A shadow moving through the mist just beyond the edge of our campfires. Light. It was tall and thin with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it moved between the trees. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. The shadow stopped for a moment as if it had heard me. And then it disappeared into the fog without making a sound. When I turned back toward camp, Jackson was standing there with his rifle in hand. "You saw it too?" he asked quietly. I nodded slowly. Neither of us said anything after that. We didn't need to. The next morning, Cameron was gone. At first, we thought he just wandered off to take pictures. He was always running ahead or lagging behind to get the perfect shot. But when an hour passed and there was no sign of him, we started to worry. "Cameron," Jackson shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Where are you?" We searched the area near our camp, calling his name over and over, but all we found were his footprints leading deeper into the swamp. They stopped abruptly near a patch of thick mud, like he'd just vanished into thin air. Elaine tried to stay calm. "Maybe he got lost and went back toward the trail," she said, but her voice cracked as she spoke. Patricia shook her head. "No, he wouldn't leave without his gear." She pointed to Cameron's backpack, which was still sitting by his tent. That's when Jackson noticed something strange nearby. A pile of sticks and leaves arranged in a pattern on the ground. It looked almost like a symbol, though none of us could figure out what it meant. "This ain't right," Jackson muttered under his breath. He gripped his rifle tighter and scanned the trees like he expected something to jump out at us. We kept searching for hours, but it was like Cameron had just disappeared. By midday, Elaine decided we needed to head back toward the main trail and call for help. But before we could leave, we found him. Cameron was lying face down in the mud near a shallow pond. His clothes were soaked, and his skin looked pale and burned, like he'd been splashed with acid. When Jackson turned him over, his eyes were wide open, but he wasn't blinking or moving. He just stared up at the sky like he couldn't see us. "Cameron?" Elaine said softly as she knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" He didn't respond. Patricia checked his pulse and nodded. "He's alive, but barely." We carried Cameron back to camp and laid him down in one of the tents. Elaine tried to clean his wounds with what little medical supplies we had, but nothing seemed to help. He just lay there staring blankly at nothing, whispering words we couldn't understand. "What's he saying?" I asked Patricia as she leaned in closer to listen. She shook her head slowly. "It sounds like a chant." "A chant?" Jackson asked, frowning. Patricia hesitated before answering. "It's Creek," she said quietly. "I don't know all of it, but it sounds like he's calling for help." Her words sent a chill down my spine. As night fell again, the mist rolled in thicker than ever before. It surrounded our camp like a wall, cutting us off from everything outside of it. The whispers started up again. Not faint this time, but loud and clear, like someone was standing right outside our tents talking to us. Jackson stayed awake all night with his rifle in hand, watching the mist for any signs of movement. I tried to sleep, but couldn't stop thinking about Cameron, about how we'd found him and what might have happened to him out there in the swamp. When morning finally came, Patricia told us she'd been reading through some of her notes about the swamp's history during the night. She'd found something that might explain what was happening, or at least give us some clues. There are stories about settlers who came here hundreds of years ago, she said as we gathered around her notebook. They found burial mounds deep in the swamp and disturbed them, took artifacts and used them for trade. And? Jackson asked impatiently. Patricia took a deep breath before continuing. Every single one of them disappeared, she said quietly. Their bodies were never found. Her words hung heavy in the air as we all stared at her in silence. You think that's what happened to Cameron? Elaine asked finally. Patricia shrugged helplessly. I don't know, but whatever's out here, it doesn't want us here. I thought about my dream, the figures painted in red and black, and wondered if they had something to do with all of this. Was it just my imagination? Or was it some kind of warning? As we packed up our gear to move again, I couldn't shake this feeling that things were about to get worse, and that none of us would make it out of this swamp alive if we didn't figure out what was going on soon. Cameron didn't get better. If anything, he got worse. By midday, he was shaking uncontrollably, mumbling words that didn't make any sense. His eyes darted back and forth like he was seeing something we couldn't. Elaine tried to keep him hydrated and calm, but nothing worked. It was like he wasn't really there anymore. Like whatever had happened to him in the swamp had taken a part of him we couldn't bring back. We decided to move camp closer to the trailhead so we could get Cameron out of the swamp faster. Jackson took the lead, his rifle ready, while Patricia stayed close to Cameron, whispering to him in Creek. She said it might help soothe him, but I wasn't sure if it was doing anything at all. The mist followed us as we walked. It wasn't just hanging in the air anymore. It was moving, swirling around us like it had a mind of its own. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of shadows in the fog, tall figures with long arms and glowing eyes, but when I turned to look directly at them, they were gone. Keep moving, Jackson said firmly. Don't stop. But then Cameron started screaming. It was a raw, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. He thrashed against Patricia's grip and fell to the ground, clawing at his own skin like he was trying to tear something off of himself. Help me, Patricia shouted as she tried to hold him down. Elaine and I ran over to help while Jackson kept watch. Cameron's screams echoed through the trees, loud enough to drown out the whispers that had been following us all day. But then something changed. The whispers stopped completely. The silence was worse than the noise. "Jackson!" I called out as I looked around nervously. He didn't answer. When I turned toward where he'd been standing just moments ago, he was gone. "Jackson!" I shouted again, my voice cracking with panic. Elaine grabbed my arm and pointed into the mist. "Look!" I squinted into the fog and saw him, Jackson, standing perfectly still about 20 feet away from us. His rifle was hanging loosely at his side, and his head was tilted back like he was staring up at something in the trees. "Jackson!" I called out again as I ran toward him. When I reached him, his eyes were wide open but unfocused, just like Cameron's had been when we found him. He didn't move or speak. He just stood there, frozen in place. "Jackson," I said softly as I shook his shoulder. He blinked once and turned to look at me slowly. "It's watching us," he whispered hoarsely. "What is?" I asked urgently. He didn't answer. He just pointed into the mist behind me. I turned around, quickly, but saw nothing except fog and trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Something just out of sight, waiting for us to let our guard down. "We need to get out of here," Elaine said firmly as she joined us with Patricia and Cameron in tow. Now, we started moving again, this time faster than before. Jackson stayed close to me but didn't say much. He just kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected whatever he'd seen earlier to come after us. As we walked, Patricia told us more about what she'd learned from her research on the swamp's history. She said there were stories about a guardian spirit that protected the land, a spirit that could take on different forms depending on what it needed to do. Sometimes it appeared as an animal, other times it looked human, or almost human. But if it's a guardian spirit, Elaine asked skeptically, why is it attacking us? Patricia hesitated before answering. Maybe it's not protecting the land anymore, she said quietly. Maybe it's angry. Her words sent a chill down my spine. By nightfall, we reached an area Patricia recognized from her notes, a clearing near an ancient burial site deep in the swamp. She said it might be connected to whatever was happening here, that if we could figure out how to communicate with the spirit or appease it somehow, we might be able to stop this nightmare before it got any worse. But as we set up camp for the night, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being watched, and that whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. By the time morning came, we knew we couldn't stay in the swamp any longer. Whatever was out here wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. Cameron was still mumbling in Creek, his voice hoarse and barely audible now. Patricia stayed close to him, trying to make sense of his words, but even she seemed unsure of what they meant. Jackson was the one who finally said what we were all thinking. "We're being hunted," he said quietly as he loaded his rifle. "Whatever's out here, it's playing with us." Elaine tried to argue. "We don't know that," she said, though her voice was shaky. "Maybe it's just an animal or something." Jackson shook his head slowly. "Animals don't act like this," he said firmly. "And they sure don't leave tracks like the ones we saw." He was right, and deep down we all knew it. As we packed up our gear to move out, Patricia pulled me aside. "Marcus," she said softly, "I think I know what's happening here." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. The Creek people believed in guardian spirits, beings that protected the land and its people. But sometimes, those spirits could be corrupted. "Corrupted how?" I asked. She looked down at the knife in her hands, the one we'd found near the burial mound, and ran her fingers over its carvings. If the land was desecrated, if burial sites were disturbed or rituals weren't performed properly, the spirits could become twisted. They'd turn against anyone who entered their territory. Her words sent a chill down my spine. "So what do we do?" I asked. She looked up at me with a determined expression. "We need to perform a ritual, a cleansing ceremony to separate the corrupted essence from the original spirit." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded insane, but then again, everything about this situation felt insane. "All right," I said finally. "What do you need?" She handed me the knife and explained the ritual, a blood offering combined with a chant in Creek that would call upon the original guardian spirit to purify the land. "We'll need to find an ancient site," she said, "somewhere sacred." Jackson overheard us and nodded grimly. "I know where to go," he said quietly. The place Jackson led us to was deep in the swamp, so deep that even he seemed uneasy about going there. The mist grew thicker with every step we took, and the air felt colder now despite the heat of the day. When we finally reached the site, it was like stepping into another world. The trees were taller here, their branches twisted into strange shapes that looked almost human. The ground was covered in moss so thick it felt like walking on carpet, and in the center of it all stood a massive tree, its trunk scarred with carvings similar to those on the knife. "This is it," Patricia said as she stepped forward cautiously. As she began preparing for the ritual, Jackson and I set up defenses around the site, traps made from branches and vines combined with markers Patricia had drawn using ash from our campfire. Elaine stayed close to Cameron, who had gone completely silent now, but still looked terrified. When everything was ready, Patricia handed me the knife and nodded toward the tree. "You have Creek blood," she said quietly. "The offering has to come from you." I hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and cutting my palm with the blade. The pain was sharp but quick, and as my blood dripped onto the ground near the base of the tree, Patricia began chanting in Creek. At first, nothing happened, but then the mist began to swirl around us like it had a mind of its own. Figures started, emerging from the fog again. tall and thin with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through us as they moved closer toward our defenses. Jackson fired his rifle at one of them, but instead of falling back like an animal would, it disappeared into the mist only to reappear seconds later in another spot. "They're testing us," Patricia said urgently as she continued chanting. The figures moved closer now, their glowing eyes fixed on me as if they knew I was part of the ritual. I tightened my grip on the knife and tried not to let my fear show, but deep down I wasn't sure if this would work or if we'd all end up like Cameron. The mist was alive now. It wasn't just swirling around us, it was moving like it had a purpose, creeping closer to where Patricia was chanting. The figures in the fog were everywhere, circling us like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Jackson fired another shot into the mist, but it didn't make any difference. The figures would vanish and reappear somewhere else, always staying just out of reach. "They're trying to stop the ritual," Patricia shouted over the sound of the chanting. Her voice was strained, and sweat dripped down her face as she kept repeating the Creek words over and over again. I stood near the tree with the knife in my hand, my blood still dripping onto the moss-covered ground below. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, but I couldn't let myself panic. Not now. Elaine was crouched next to Cameron, who had started mumbling again. His voice was low and shaky, but Patricia glanced at him and nodded like she understood what he was saying. "He's helping," she said quickly. "He's calling to the Guardian. Spirit." The mist grew even thicker after that, and for a moment I thought we were going to lose sight of each other completely. But then something changed. The carvings on the tree began to glow faintly, their light cutting through the fog like a beacon. The figures in the mist stopped moving and turned toward the tree as if they were drawn to it. "This is it," Patricia shouted. "Keep them away from me while I finish." Jackson nodded and reloaded his rifle while Elaine grabbed a branch from our campfire and held it like a torch. I tightened my grip on the knife and stepped closer to Patricia, ready to defend her if anything came too close. The figures started moving again, faster this time, and one of them lunged toward Jackson with its long arms stretched out like claws. He fired a shot straight into its chest, but instead of disappearing like before, it let out a horrible screech that echoed through the swamp before collapsing onto the ground. "They can be hurt," Jackson shouted triumphantly. But before we could celebrate, another figure appeared behind him and swiped at his back with its claw-like hands. Jackson stumbled forward but managed to turn around and fire another shot before it could attack again. "Marcus," Patricia called out urgently. "The knife, it's reacting." I looked down at the blade in my hand and saw that its carvings were glowing now too, brighter than anything else around us. "You have to use it," she said desperately. "Cut into the tree. It'll release the guardian spirit." I hesitated for a moment as I stared at the massive tree in front of me. Its trunk was scarred with carvings that looked ancient, almost alive in their own way. "Do it," Jackson shouted as he fired another shot into the mist. Taking a deep breath, I raised the knife and plunged it into one of the carvings on the tree's trunk. The moment the blade made contact, everything changed. The mist exploded, outward like a shockwave, knocking all of us off our feet and sending the figures in the fog scattering in every direction. For a moment, everything went silent. No whispers, no movement, just an eerie stillness that felt almost peaceful. And then we saw it, the guardian spirit. It rose from the base of the tree like smoke, its form shifting and changing as it moved toward us. It wasn't like the figures we'd seen before. It felt pure somehow, like it belonged here. Patricia stared at it with wide eyes as she whispered something in Creek under her breath. The spirit turned toward her and nodded slowly before moving toward Cameron. It hovered over him for a moment before sinking into his body completely. Cameron gasped loudly and sat up straight, his eyes wide with shock but clear now, no longer filled with fear or confusion. "It worked," Patricia said softly as she helped him to his feet. But before we could celebrate, the spirit turned toward me and spoke, not with words but with feelings that filled my mind completely. It thanked me for freeing it, but warned me that its corrupted essence would remain in this swamp forever. a reminder of what happens when sacred lands are desecrated. As quickly as it had appeared, the spirit vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but silence once more. The swamp was quiet now. Too quiet. The mist had disappeared completely, leaving behind a stillness that felt unnatural. The air was heavy, but not in the suffocating way it had been before. It was more like the swamp was holding its breath, waiting for something. Cameron was standing now, leaning against Elaine for support. He looked pale and weak, but his eyes were clear again, no longer haunted by whatever had taken hold of him before. "What happened?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Patricia knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were touched by the spirit," she said gently. "It used you to warn us." He blinked slowly, like he was trying to process her words. "I don't remember anything," he admitted. "It's probably better that way," Jackson muttered as he slung his rifle over his shoulder. We packed up our gear in silence, none of us saying much as we prepared to leave the swamp. The weight of what had happened hung over us like a cloud, and even Jackson, who usually had something to say about everything, seemed lost in his own thoughts. As we made our way back toward the edge of the swamp, I couldn't shake this feeling that we weren't alone. Not in the way we'd been hunted before, but in a different way, like something was watching over us now. When we finally reached the road where our vehicles were parked, it felt like stepping into another world. The air was lighter here, and the sun was shining through the trees like nothing had ever been wrong. But I knew better. As we loaded our gear into the trucks, Patricia pulled me aside one last time. "Marcus," she said softly, "you need to know something." "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "The spirit. It left something behind in you." I stared at her for a moment, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" She glanced down at my hand, the one I'd used to cut myself during the ritual, and then back up at me with a serious expression. "You can see them now," she said quietly. "See what?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, but instead gestured toward the swamp behind us. "The Mistwalkers," she said finally. "They'll always be there, but now you'll know when they're near." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Is that supposed to be a good thing?" I asked nervously. She shrugged slightly. "It's not good or bad. It just is." As we drove away from the swamp, I couldn't stop thinking about what Patricia had said, or about everything we'd seen and done out there. The official report blamed everything on swamp gas poisoning, hallucinations caused by exposure to methane or some other chemical released during the drought. But I knew better. The swamp wasn't just a place. It was alive in ways most people would never understand. And while we might have survived this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Even now, weeks later, I still have dreams about the mist, about shadows moving through it and glowing eyes watching me from just beyond my reach. And sometimes when I'm alone, when everything is quiet, I swear I can hear whispers again. My name is Daniel Matthews, and I've always loved the quiet of the wilderness. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant calls of wildlife that makes you feel alive. That's why I took the job as a forest ranger at Whispering Pines, a remote wilderness area tucked far away from civilization. It sounded like a dream come true. But if I had known what was waiting for me there, I would have never set foot in that forest. It all started on my first day. The ranger station was an old wooden cabin, creaky and weathered but cozy in its own way. I met my team, Dr. Laura Winters, a wildlife biologist, Kevin Jacobs, a young and eager photographer, and Thomas Green, a seasoned tracker who seemed to know every inch of the forest. They were good people, and we all shared a love for nature. As I settled in, I couldn't help but notice something odd. The previous ranger, a man named Alan Carter, had left abruptly without much explanation. He'd been here for years, but suddenly quit and disappeared. All he left behind were some old journals filled with strange symbols and cryptic notes. I asked Thomas about it, but he just shrugged and said Alan had lost his mind after spending too much time alone in the woods. At first, everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could be in such an isolated place. We spent our days hiking trails, monitoring wildlife, and making sure campers followed the rules. But there was something about Whispering Pines that felt off. The forest was too quiet sometimes, like it was holding its breath. And at night, when the wind blew through the trees, it almost sounded like whispering voices. One evening, as we sat around the campfire outside the station, Kevin brought up the strange carvings he'd seen on some of the trees during his hike earlier that day. He showed us pictures on his camera, symbols etched deep into the bark, almost like runes. None of us could explain them. Laura joked that maybe they were left by ancient tribes or bored campers, but her laugh sounded forced. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us out there in the dark. The wind picked up outside, carrying with it that eerie whispering sound again. It wasn't words exactly, just faint murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right about this place. And that was just the beginning. The next morning started like any other. The sun was shining, the air smelled fresh, and the forest seemed peaceful. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I tried to brush it off as nerves. It was my first week after all. But something about Whispering Pines felt wrong. Kevin was up early, excited to explore more of the area and take photos. He had a knack for finding beauty in the smallest details, like the way sunlight hit a spider's web or how moss grew in intricate patterns on tree trunks. Laura and Thomas were busy cataloging wildlife sightings, so I decided to join Kevin on his hike. We followed one of the marked trails deeper into the forest. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds chirped overhead, squirrels darted across. The path and the occasional deer peeked out from behind the trees. But as we walked further, the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds of nature faded until all we could hear was the crunch of leaves under our boots. "Do you hear that?" Kevin asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Hear what?" I replied. "Exactly," he said, looking around nervously. "It's too quiet." I hadn't noticed it until he pointed it out, but he was right. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It felt like we had stepped into a vacuum where sound didn't exist. We kept walking, trying to shake off the strange silence. That's when Kevin spotted something unusual. Just off the trail, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, was a small clearing, with several trees marked by strange carvings, the same symbols he'd photographed the day before. They were deep and precise, almost like someone had used a knife or chisel to carve them. "Who do you think did this?" Kevin asked, snapping pictures. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe campers? Or someone messing around?" Kevin frowned and pointed to one of the symbols. "This one looks fresh." I leaned in closer and saw what he meant. The edges of the carving were clean and sharp, not weathered like the others. Whoever made it had been here recently. We decided to head back to camp and show Laura and Thomas what we'd found. But as we turned to leave, I noticed something strange on the ground near one of the carved trees. Tracks. They weren't animal tracks or boot prints. They were long and narrow with deep grooves, almost like claws dragging through the dirt. "Kevin," I called out quietly, "look at this." He crouched down beside me and stared at the tracks. "What kind of animal makes prints like that?" "I don't think it's an animal," I said softly, trying not to let my voice shake. We followed the tracks for a few yards before they disappeared into a dense thicket of trees. Whatever had made them was gone now, or hiding somewhere nearby. When we got back to camp, Laura and Thomas listened carefully as we described what we'd seen. Laura seemed intrigued but skeptical. Thomas looked worried. Alan used to talk. About stuff like that, Thomas said after a long pause. Tracks that didn't match any known animals. Symbols carved into trees overnight. He said it was just part of this place, something you learn to live with. What does that mean? I asked. Thomas shrugged but didn't answer. That night, as we sat around the campfire again, I couldn't stop thinking about those carvings and tracks. The wind picked up once more, carrying that faint whispering sound through the trees. This time, it felt closer, like it was circling us. I stared into the darkness beyond our campfire's glow, half expecting something to step out of the shadows at any moment, but nothing came. Not yet. The next few days were strange, to say the least. It was like the forest had decided to play tricks on us. Trails we'd walked before seemed to shift overnight, making it hard to find our way back. Equipment would go missing or turn up in odd places. My flashlight, for example, was found hanging from a tree branch nearly 20 feet off the ground. None of us could explain how it got there. Kevin started acting differently too. He was usually upbeat and full of energy, but now he seemed distracted and tired. He said he hadn't been sleeping well and kept waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was standing over him. I didn't want to admit it, but I'd felt the same thing. A heavy, uneasy presence that made my skin crawl. One evening, Laura suggested we set up night vision cameras around the camp to see if we could catch anything unusual. It sounded like a good idea, so we spent the rest of the day placing cameras along the trails and near the carved trees Kevin had found. That night, as we sat in the ranger station reviewing the footage, something caught our attention. One of the cameras had picked up movement, a shadowy figure darting between the trees. It was fast, almost too fast to see clearly, but it was definitely there. Laura paused the video and rewound it several times, trying to get a better look. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. None of us had an answer. The figure didn't look like an animal. It was tall and upright, moving with a strange, jerky motion. Thomas leaned closer to the screen and muttered something under his breath. "What did you say?" I asked. "Alan used to talk about them," Thomas said quietly. He called them the Watchers. Said they only come out at night. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are they?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. Alan said they're part of the forest, like it's alive somehow." We decided to stay inside that night, locking the doors and windows just in case. But even with the safety of the station around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching and waiting. The next morning brought more unsettling discoveries. Kevin had gone out early to check one of the cameras but hadn't returned by midday. Laura and I went looking for him while Thomas stayed behind to monitor our radios. We found Kevin sitting on a fallen log about 2 miles from camp, staring blankly at the ground. His camera was lying beside him, smashed to pieces. "Kevin!" Laura called out as we ran toward him. He didn't respond at first, just kept staring at something in his hands. A small wooden carving shaped like one of those strange symbols. From the trees. "Where did you get this?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "I don't know," Kevin said softly, his voice distant. "I woke up here. I don't remember how I got here." Laura looked worried but tried to stay calm. "It's okay," she said gently. "Let's get you back to camp." As we helped Kevin back to his feet, I couldn't help but notice how pale he looked, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain or understand. When we got back to camp, Thomas met us at the door with a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said. He led us inside and showed us another piece of footage from one of the cameras, a close-up shot of one of those figures standing just outside our campfire's light. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching us. "That's not normal," Thomas said firmly. "We need to figure out what's going on before someone gets hurt." I nodded, but deep down I knew we were already in over our heads. The next day, Kevin seemed even worse. He was quiet, almost withdrawn, and kept staring off into the distance like he was looking for something. Or someone. Laura tried to talk to him, but he barely responded. It was like he wasn't fully there anymore. Thomas suggested we take shifts keeping an eye on him while also continuing our work. We couldn't just sit around waiting for answers, but we also couldn't ignore what was happening to Kevin. I volunteered to stay with him while Laura and Thomas went out to check the cameras again. As the day went on, Kevin started mumbling under his breath. At first, I thought he was talking to me, but when I listened closely, I realized he wasn't saying anything I could understand. It sounded like gibberish, or maybe a language I didn't know. "Kevin," I said gently, "are you okay?" Looked at me with tired eyes and shook his head. "They're coming," he whispered. "Who's coming?" I asked, trying not to sound scared. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up suddenly and started walking toward the forest. I jumped up and grabbed his arm. "Kevin, wait, you can't go out there." "They want me," he said, pulling away. From me, with surprising strength. "I have to go." Before I could stop him, he disappeared into the trees. I called out his name over and over again, but he didn't respond. The forest swallowed him whole. Panicking, I ran back to the station and told Thomas and Laura what had happened. We grabbed our gear and set out to find him before nightfall. The sun was already sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trails. We followed Kevin's tracks as best we could, but they seemed to zigzag in random directions, leading us deeper into the forest than we'd ever been before. The air grew colder, and the silence returned. The same eerie silence that had unnerved us days ago. Finally, we found something. A small clearing surrounded by trees marked with those strange carvings. In the center of the clearing was Kevin's radio, placed neatly on a flat rock as if someone had left it there for us to find. "Where is he?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Thomas said grimly. "But we need to get out of here." Just as we turned to leave, a faint sound reached us, whispering. It was soft at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around us. "Stay together," Thomas said firmly, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. The whispering grew louder until it felt like it was inside my head. I couldn't make out any words. It was just a constant murmur that made my skin crawl. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Shadows darting between the trees. "They're here," Laura said shakily. Suddenly, Thomas pointed his flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. The beam caught something. A tall figure, standing just beyond the light's reach. Its shape was human-like but distorted somehow. Too thin and too tall with long limbs that didn't move naturally. "Run!" Thomas shouted. We bolted back toward camp as fast as we could, not daring to look back. The whispering followed us all the way, growing louder and more frantic until it felt like it would burst my eardrums. When we finally reached the station and slammed the door shut behind us, everything went quiet again. No whispers, no shadows, just silence. "What is happening?" Laura asked breathlessly. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever those things are, they're not human." I looked out the window into the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there was Kevin, and something else, something that wanted us gone. After the chaos of the night, none of us slept. We stayed huddled in the ranger station, listening to the creaks of the old wooden cabin and jumping at every sound outside. The forest felt alive, like it was pressing in on us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Laura spent the early hours of the morning flipping through Alan's old journals. She'd been skeptical about them at first, dismissing them as ramblings, from a man who'd spent too much time alone. But now, she was desperate for answers. Anything that could explain what was happening. "These symbols," Laura said, pointing to a page filled with sketches of carvings similar to the ones we'd seen on the trees. Alan thought they were some kind of language, like the forest was trying to communicate. "Communicate?" I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief. "With who?" Laura looked up at me, her face pale and serious. "With us. Thomas scoffed and shook his head. That's crazy. Trees don't talk. Maybe not, Laura said, quietly. But what if it's not just the trees? What if it's something bigger? Something alive? Her words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. None of us wanted to believe it, but after what we'd seen and heard, it was hard to argue. As the sun rose, we decided to go back out and search for Kevin again. We couldn't just leave him out there, no matter how dangerous it was. Thomas insisted on bringing extra gear, flares, radios, anything that might help us if we ran into trouble. The forest felt different in daylight. Not safer, just quieter. The whispering was gone for now, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for us to make our move. We followed Kevin's tracks, deeper into the woods until we came across something unexpected. A small bunker hidden beneath a mound of earth and leaves. It looked old and abandoned, with rusted metal doors and a broken lock. "What is this?" I asked. Thomas frowned and shook his head. "I've never seen this before." Laura stepped forward cautiously and pushed open one of the doors. Inside, it was dark and musty, with shelves lined with canned food and stacks of old notebooks. In the corner was a single cot, and someone sitting on it. "Alan?" Laura whispered. The man looked up slowly, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. It was Alan Carter, the previous ranger who had disappeared months ago. "You shouldn't be here," Alan said weakly, his voice barely audible. "What happened to you?" I asked, stepping closer. Alan shook his head and muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't understand. Then he looked at me with a haunted expression and said, "They don't want you here. They want you gone." "Who?" Laura asked urgently. "Who are they?" Alan didn't answer right away. He just stared at the floor like he was trying to remember something important. Finally, he said, "The forest. It's alive, and it doesn't trust us." His words sent a chill down my spine. Before we could ask more questions, Alan grabbed my arm with surprising strength and whispered urgently, "Leave while you still can." Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from outside, the sound of branches snapping and something heavy moving through the trees. "They're here," Alan said sharply. "You need to go." We didn't wait to be told twice. Grabbing what little information we could from Alan's bunker, including one of his notebooks, we bolted back toward camp as fast as we could. The forest seemed to close in around us as we ran. The trees tighter together, the shadows darker than they should have been in daylight. I could feel something behind us, its presence heavy and suffocating. When we finally reached the station, again, slamming the door shut behind us, I realized my hands were shaking uncontrollably. "What now?" Laura asked breathlessly. Thomas looked at Alan's notebook, the pages filled with warnings about creatures he called the Watchers and their connection to the forest itself. "We fight," Thomas said grimly, "or we leave." But deep down, I knew leaving wasn't an option anymore, not for Kevin or for us. The decision to stay wasn't easy, but it felt like the only choice. Kevin was still out there, and even though Alan's warnings chilled us to the core, we couldn't abandon him. We spent the next few hours preparing, checking our gear, gathering supplies, and trying to come up with a plan. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew the truth. Whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive again. The whispering returned, faint at first, like a distant breeze. But as night fell, it grew louder, circling the station like unseen voices calling out to us. "We need to move." "Now," Thomas said firmly, gripping his flashlight and flare gun. "If we wait any longer, we'll lose him for good." Laura nodded, her face pale but determined. I grabbed my own gear and followed them out into the darkness. The air was cold and heavy, and every step felt like it was being watched. We followed, the trail deeper into the forest, guided by faint signs of Kevin's presence. A broken branch here, a dropped piece of equipment there, but as we moved further away from camp, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just random murmurs anymore. It sounded like voices, dozens of them, speaking in unison. "Do you hear that?" Laura asked quietly. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. It's like they're talking. Thomas didn't respond. He just kept moving forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, he stopped and held up his hand. "Wait," he whispered. Ahead of us was another clearing, this one larger than the last. In the center was a figure lying on the ground. It was Kevin. "Kevin!" Laura called out as she ran toward him, but Thomas grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "Wait," he said sharply. "Something's not right." I shone my flashlight on Kevin's body and felt my stomach drop. He was alive, but barely. His skin was pale and covered in strange markings that looked almost like scars or burns. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring blankly at the sky. "Kevin," I said softly as I knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" He didn't respond at first, but then he muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't understand. "What is he saying?" Laura asked nervously. Thomas shook his head. "It's not English." Suddenly, Kevin's body jerked violently and he let out a guttural scream that echoed through the trees. The whispering around us stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence. And then, they came. From the shadows beyond the clearing emerged figures, tall and thin with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. They moved slowly at first, their bodies unnaturally jerky as if they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. "Get back!" Thomas shouted, firing his flare gun into the air. The bright light illuminated the clearing for a split second, revealing more of them, dozens of figures surrounding us on all sides. They didn't flinch or retreat, they just stood there, watching. Laura grabbed Kevin's arm and tried to pull him to his feet, but he was too weak to move. "Help me!" she cried. I rushed to her side and helped lift Kevin while Thomas kept his flashlight trained on the creatures. They didn't move closer, but they didn't back away either. As we stumbled back toward camp with Kevin between us, I could feel their presence growing stronger, their glowing eyes following our every move. The whispering returned again, louder this time, almost deafening. When we finally reached the station and slammed the door shut behind us, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Laura checked Kevin's pulse while Thomas barricaded the windows with whatever furniture he could find. "What are they?" Laura asked shakily. Thomas didn't answer right away. He just looked out the window into the darkness beyond and said quietly, "They're not human." Kevin stirred weakly on the floor and muttered something again, the same strange words he'd spoken before. Laura leaned in closer to hear him. "They're coming," he whispered, and deep down, I knew he was right. The hours after we brought Kevin back were some of the longest of my life. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, and those strange markings on his skin seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. Laura tried to keep him stable, but she was just as scared as the rest of us. The whispering outside hadn't stopped. It was louder now, almost rhythmic, like a chant. Thomas stayed by the window, gripping his flashlight and flare gun tightly. He hadn't said much since we got back, but I could tell he was on edge. Every so often, he'd glance outside, his jaw clenched as if expecting something to burst through the door at any moment. I sat on the floor next to Kevin, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The creatures, the Watchers, they weren't just stalking us anymore. They were playing with us, testing us, and whatever they wanted, it wasn't good. Suddenly, Kevin stirred and whispered something under his breath. I leaned closer to hear him. "They know," he muttered. "Kevin," I said softly, "what do they know?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered open for a moment and he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Fear mixed with something else. Acceptance. "They know who you are," he said weakly. "They know everything." Before I could ask what he meant, there was a loud knock at the door, 3 sharp bangs that echoed through the cabin. We all froze. Did you hear that? Laura whispered. Thomas nodded and moved toward the door cautiously. Stay back, he said firmly. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone, or something, was demanding to be let in. Thomas peered through the peephole and immediately stepped back, his face pale. It's not human. What do you mean? I asked. It's one of them, he said quietly. But it's different. Laura grabbed my arm and pulled me toward Kevin. We need to get out of here, she said urgently. But before we could move, the whispering outside changed. It wasn't just murmurs anymore. It was voices, clear and distinct, and they sounded familiar. Daniel. A voice called softly from outside. I froze. It wasn't just any voice. It was my mother's voice. Daniel, she called again, her tone calm and soothing. It's okay. Open the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door. It couldn't be her. It wasn't possible. But the voice was perfect. Every word sounded exactly like her. Don't listen, Thomas said sharply. It's not real. How do you know? I asked, my voice shaking. Because they did the same thing to Alan, he replied grimly. They use your memories against you. The voices outside grew louder, overlapping each other until they filled the room with their eerie chorus. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were calling Laura's and Thomas's too. Laura, a man's voice said warmly. It's me. Dad. Laura's eyes widened in shock and she shook her head violently. No, he's dead. They're trying to break us, Thomas said firmly. Don't let them in. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence once again. But the damage had been done. We were shaken to our core. Kevin stirred again and muttered something under his breath, this time louder than before. They're coming, he said weakly, his voice trembling. What do they want? Laura asked, desperately. Kevin looked at her with hollow eyes and whispered one word. You. Kevin's single word. You. Hung in the air like a weight pressing down on all of us. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. The whispering outside had stopped again, but the silence was worse. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to make our next move. Thomas finally broke the silence. We can't stay here. They're not going to stop. Laura looked at him, her face pale and drawn. And go where? They're everywhere out there. We need to figure out what they want, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. If we don't, they'll just keep coming. Thomas frowned, clearly not liking the idea. You're saying we should talk. To them? Are you out of your mind? Do we have another choice? I shot back. They've already taken Kevin. If we don't do something, we're next. Laura hesitated, then nodded slowly. Daniel's right. If they wanted to kill us, they would have done it by now. They're trying to communicate. Thomas muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. I turned to Kevin, who was lying on the floor, barely conscious. His breathing was shallow, and those strange markings on his skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the cabin. Kevin, I said softly, kneeling beside him. Can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with a mix of fear and exhaustion. What do they want? I asked gently. They protect, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Protect what? Laura asked urgently. The forest, Kevin said, his words slurring together. We don't belong here. We're intruders. The pieces started to click together in my mind. The carvings on the trees, the strange tracks, the watchers. They weren't random. They were warnings. We'd crossed into their territory, and now they were deciding what to do with us. We need to show them we're not a threat, I said firmly. If this is about protecting the forest, Maybe there's a way to prove we mean no harm." "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Thomas asked skeptically. I didn't have an answer right away, but then I remembered Alan's notebook, the one we'd taken from his bunker. I grabbed it from the table and flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for, a rough sketch of a clearing deep in the forest with symbols carved into the ground. "This," I said, pointing to the drawing. "Alan wrote that this place is important to them. It's where they gather." "You want to go there?" Thomas asked incredulously. "That's suicide." "It's our only chance," I replied. "If we can reach it and show them we understand, maybe they'll let us go." Laura nodded reluctantly. "It's risky, but it might work." Thomas sighed heavily but didn't argue further. "Fine," he said gruffly. "But if this goes south, we're getting out of there, fast." We spent the next hour preparing for what felt like a final stand. Laura packed medical supplies in case things went wrong. Thomas loaded up on flares and flashlights, and I studied Alan's notes carefully, memorizing every detail about the clearing and its location. As we stepped out into the night once again, the air felt heavier than before, thick with tension and anticipation. The whispering had returned, faint but ever present, like a distant hum that followed us wherever we went. The journey to the clearing was slow and nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race, but we pressed on, guided by Alan's notes and sheer determination. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached it. A large open space surrounded by towering trees marked with those same strange carvings. In the center of the clearing was a circle of symbols etched into the ground, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "This is it," I said quietly. The whispering grew louder as we stepped into the clearing, filling my ears with an almost deafening hum, and then everything went still. The watchers emerged from the shadows one by one, their tall, distorted forms moving with an unnatural grace. They surrounded us completely but didn't come closer. They just stood there, watching. I took a deep breath and stepped forward cautiously, holding up my hands to show I wasn't a threat. "We don't mean any harm," I said loudly, my voice trembling slightly but steady enough to carry across the clearing. "We just want to understand." For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of them stepped forward, a little taller than the others with markings on its body that glowed brighter than anything else in the clearing. It tilted its head as if studying me before reaching out with one long, thin arm and pointing toward Alan's notebook in my hand. I hesitated for only a second before placing it on the ground in front of me and stepping back. The creature knelt down slowly and touched the notebook with its elongated fingers. The markings on its body pulsed brighter for a moment before it looked up at me again, and then at Kevin lying unconscious behind us. "They're deciding," Laura whispered nervously, and as I stood there under their unblinking gaze, I realized she was right. The clearing was dead silent now, except for the faint hum of the glowing symbols on the ground. The watchers stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on us. The one kneeling by Alan's notebook seemed to be studying it, or maybe it was studying us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Kevin groaned softly behind us, and Laura knelt down to check on him. "He's getting worse," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to do something." I didn't know what to do. The watchers weren't attacking, but they weren't backing off either. It was like they were waiting for something, some kind of decision. Then, without warning, the forest around us came alive. The trees began to sway violently, even though there was no wind. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the clearing. It wasn't just the watchers anymore. It was the forest itself. It felt alive, like it was watching us, judging us. "They're not going to let us leave," Thomas said grimly, gripping his flare gun tightly. "Wait," I said quickly, holding up my hand. "We have to show them we're not a threat." "How?" Laura asked desperately. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But then I remembered something Alan had written in his notebook. The forest doesn't trust humans because we take without asking. To survive here, you have to give something back. I took a deep breath and stepped forward again, my hands raised. "We don't want to hurt you," I said loudly, my voice shaking but steady enough to carry across the clearing. "We just want Kevin back, and we'll leave your forest alone." The watcher with the glowing markings tilted its head again, as if considering my words. Then it pointed at me with one long finger and gestured toward the center of the clearing. "What's it doing?" Thomas asked warily. I swallowed hard. "I think it wants me to step into the circle." "Are you insane?" Thomas hissed. "You don't know what'll happen." "I don't think we have a choice," I said quietly. "If this is how we prove we're not a threat, then I'll do it." Laura grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel, no. What if they—" "I'll be okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "Just trust me." I stepped into the glowing circle slowly, feeling the hum of energy beneath my feet as I moved closer to the center. The watchers didn't move. They just watched silently as I knelt down and placed both hands on the ground. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, everything changed. The symbols beneath me flared brightly, blinding me with their light. My body felt weightless, like I was floating in midair. And then, I saw them. Not just the watchers, but everything. The forest unfolded before me like a living tapestry. Every tree, every animal, every blade of grass connected by an invisible web of energy that pulsed with life. The watchers weren't just protecting the forest. They were the forest. They were its guardians, its voice, and they were angry. Images flashed through my mind. Trees being cut down, animals fleeing from fire and destruction, rivers choked with pollution. They showed me what humans had done to their world, and why they didn't trust us anymore. "I'm sorry," I whispered aloud, tears streaming down my face. "We didn't know." The light around me dimmed slightly, and for a moment I thought they might forgive us. But then another image appeared. Kevin lying unconscious in the clearing, his body marked by their symbols. They weren't just angry at humanity. They were angry at us. We had trespassed into their sacred space without permission, and now we had to pay the price. "No," I shouted desperately. "Take me instead. Let them go." The watchers hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. The light around me faded completely as they stepped back into the shadows one by one, until only the leader remained. It looked at me for what felt like an eternity before finally nodding once and disappearing into the darkness. The forest fell silent again. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the clearing with Laura and Thomas kneeling beside me. Kevin was still unconscious but breathing more steadily now, and the markings on his skin were gone. "They let us go," Laura said softly, her voice filled with relief and disbelief. "For now," Thomas added grimly. As we carried Kevin back toward camp under the pale light of dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that we'd been given a second chance, but only just barely. And as I glanced back at the forest one last time before stepping into the safety of our station, I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching from the shadows. The morning after we returned to the station felt surreal. The forest was quiet again, almost peaceful, but none of us felt safe. Kevin was still weak but alive, and the strange markings on his skin had completely faded. Laura stayed by his side, watching over him while Thomas and I tried to make sense of what had happened. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. The watchers had let us go, but it was clear they hadn't forgiven us. We were intruders in their world, and they'd made sure we understood that. By midday, Kevin finally woke up fully. He looked around the room, confused and disoriented. What happened?" he asked weakly. "You're okay now," Laura said softly, brushing his hair back from his face. "You're safe." Kevin frowned and shook his head slowly. "No, we're not." His words sent a chill through me. He didn't remember much about what had happened in the forest, but he said he could still feel them, the watchers, like they were lingering just out of sight. Thomas didn't waste any time packing up our gear. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Today." I couldn't argue with him. Staying in Whispering Pines felt like tempting fate, and none of us wanted to push our luck any further. As we loaded up the truck and prepared to leave, I took one last look at the forest. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It looked normal, beautiful even, but I knew better now. Whispering Pines wasn't just a wilderness area. It was alive, and it didn't want us there. Alan's notebook sat on the dashboard beside me as we drove away. I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. It felt like a piece of the puzzle we'd barely begun to understand. Maybe someday someone would figure out how to communicate with the Watchers without angering them. But it wouldn't be us. The drive back to civilization was quiet. Kevin stared out the window, lost in thought, while Laura kept glancing at him nervously as if afraid he might slip away again. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When we finally reached town, we reported everything to our supervisor. Well, almost everything. We told them about Kevin's disappearance and how we'd found him. Injured in the forest, but left out the parts about the Watchers and Alan's warnings. Who would believe us anyway? The official report chalked it up to a combination of exhaustion and environmental stress. A convenient explanation that avoided any mention of supernatural forces or ancient guardians. Whispering Pines was closed off indefinitely after that. The area was declared federally protected due to environmental concerns, and no one was allowed to enter without special permission. It was as if the government knew something but didn't want anyone else finding out. As for us, we went our separate ways. Laura quit her job as a wildlife biologist and moved back home to be closer to her family. Kevin recovered physically but struggled with nightmares for months afterward, dreams filled with glowing eyes and whispering voices that never seemed to fade. Thomas stayed in the field but refused to work in remote areas anymore. He said he'd seen enough wilderness for a lifetime. And me? I couldn't stop thinking about Whispering Pines, the Watchers, the forest, everything we'd experienced there. Sometimes I dreamed about them too, about their glowing eyes watching from the shadows or their voices calling my name in the wind. I never went back, but sometimes I wonder if they're still there, waiting in the darkness for someone else to stumble into their world. And every now and then, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I swear I can hear faint whispers coming from somewhere just beyond my window. My name is Michael Lawson, and I've seen things that would make even the bravest person question reality. I wasn't always like this, paranoid, sleepless, and haunted by shadows. No, I used to be normal. I had a job as a wildlife photographer, traveling to remote places to capture the beauty of nature. But one trip changed everything. It all started when I got a call from an old friend, Catherine. She was a journalist working on a story about a series of mysterious disappearances in the Pine Ridge National Forest. Hikers had been going missing for years, but no one had ever found a trace of them. Not a single clue. Some said it was wild, animals. Others whispered about something unnatural. Catherine wanted me to join her team as they investigated the area. She said my experience in the wilderness would be invaluable. At first, I hesitated. The idea of spending weeks in a forest with such a dark reputation didn't sit well with me. But Catherine was persuasive, and honestly, I needed the money. So I agreed. A week later, we were driving into Pine Ridge. The forest was massive, endless, rows of towering trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something off about it too. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Our team consisted of 5 people. Catherine, me, Sam, a tech guy who brought all kinds of gadgets, Elena, a survival expert, and Mark, a historian who specialized in local legends. We set up camp near an old logging trail that hadn't been used in decades. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. That first night around the campfire, Mark told us about the legend of the Midnight Pack. According to local folklore, a group of loggers had gone missing in these woods over a century ago. People said they were cursed and turned into something else, something that still roamed the forest at night. We laughed it off at first, just another scary campfire story, right? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The next morning, we started our investigation. Catherine wanted to check out the area where the most recent hikers had disappeared, a trail called Black Hollow. It was about a 2-hour hike from our camp, deep into the forest. The path was narrow, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in around us. The deeper we went, the darker it got, even though it was still early in the day. As we walked, I noticed something strange. The trees looked wrong. Their bark was pale and cracked like they were sick or dying. Some of them had deep claw marks running down their trunks as if something had been sharpening its nails on them. I pointed it out to Elena, but she shrugged. Eyed off. "Probably bears," she said. "They do that sometimes." But it didn't feel like bears. About halfway to Black Hollow, Sam stopped suddenly and held up his hand. "Do you hear that?" he asked. We all froze and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. But then I caught it, a faint whispering sound like voices carried on the breeze. It was so quiet that I couldn't make out any words, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. We kept moving, but the forest felt different now, heavier somehow, like we were walking into something we shouldn't be part of. The whispering grew louder as we approached Black Hollow, and by the time we reached the trailhead, it sounded like it was coming from all directions. That's when we found the first sign of trouble, a backpack lying in the middle of the trail. It was torn open, its contents scattered across the dirt, clothes, a water bottle, a map. Catherine picked it up and checked the tag inside. "It belongs to one of the missing hikers," she said quietly. Elena crouched down to examine the ground. "Around us, there's no blood," she said after a moment. "No signs of a struggle." "Then where are they?" Sam asked. No one had an answer. We decided to keep going, but every step felt heavier than the last. The whispering never stopped. It only got louder and closer. By the time we reached a clearing at the end of Black Hollow, I felt like I couldn't breathe, and then we saw it, an unnatural ice formation in the center of the clearing. It looked like frozen spikes rising out of the ground in random directions, glistening in the sunlight even though there was no snow or frost anywhere else in the forest. "What is that?" Catherine whispered. Mark stepped closer to get a better look, but Elena grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Don't touch it," she warned. I didn't need her warning. I could feel it from where I stood. That ice wasn't normal. It gave off a strange energy that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, Sam's equipment started going haywire. His handheld GPS beeped wildly and his camera shut off on its own. "Something's messing with my gear," he said nervously. That's when I noticed something else. There were no shadows around us anymore. The sunlight hit everything directly, but nothing cast a shadow. Not us, not the trees, not even the ice formation. I don't know how long we stood there in silence before Catherine finally spoke up. "Let's head back to camp," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out later." No one argued. We just turned and started walking as fast as we could without breaking into a run. We made it back to camp just as the sun was starting to set. The forest was eerily quiet again, and the heavy feeling in the air hadn't gone away. None of us said much as we unpacked our gear and sat around the campfire. It was like we were all trying to process what we'd seen at Black Hollow without saying it out loud. Catherine finally broke the silence. "That ice? It doesn't make any sense. There's no way something like that should exist out here. Not in this climate. It's not just the ice, I said, my voice low. The shadows were gone. Did anyone else notice that? Everyone nodded, but no one had an explanation. Mark, who usually had some historical or scientific tidbit to share, just stared into the fire, his face pale. Elena spoke up next. Whatever's going on here, it's not natural. I've been in forests all over the world, and I've never seen anything like this. Sam was fiddling with his equipment, trying to figure out why it had stopped working earlier. It's like something scrambled everything, he muttered. My GPS, my camera, even my watch stopped for a while. Maybe it's electromagnetic interference, Catherine suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. From what? Sam shot back. There's no power lines, no towers, nothing out here. We all fell silent again, staring into the fire as if it could give us answers. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering again. Soft and distant at first, but growing louder until it felt like someone was standing right next to me. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing there, just the dark shapes of trees outside my tent. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of Elena shouting. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent to find her standing near the edge of camp with her flashlight pointed into the trees. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I saw something," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Something big." Catherine and Sam joined us a moment later, both looking groggy but alert. "What did you see?" Catherine asked. Elena shook her head. "I don't know. It moved too fast. But it was watching us." Mark came out of his tent last, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" Before anyone could answer, we all heard it. A low growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, almost like a rumble that you could feel in your chest. We stood frozen for what felt like forever, straining our ears to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then we saw them. 2 glowing eyes staring at us from between the trees. "Back to the fire," Elena whispered urgently. "Now." We moved slowly toward the campfire, keeping our flashlights trained on the eyes. As we got closer to the firelight, the eyes disappeared into the shadows. "What was that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. "No idea," Elena replied grimly. "But it's not alone." She pointed toward another set of glowing eyes further down the tree line, and then another, and another. Soon there were at least half a dozen pairs of eyes watching us from all directions. "They're surrounding us," Catherine whispered. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it in front of me like a weapon, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The others followed suit, each of us holding on to whatever source of light we could find. For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we stood there in a tight circle around the fire, waiting for something to happen. But just as suddenly, as they had appeared, the eyes vanished. "They're gone," Mark said softly. "For now," Elena added grimly. No one slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, the camp felt different. The air was colder and the forest seemed darker, even though the sun was shining. None of us spoke much as we packed up our gear. We were all on edge after what had happened the night before. I could tell everyone was thinking the same thing. Whatever those glowing eyes belonged to, they weren't normal animals. Catherine decided we should head deeper into the forest to investigate another area where hikers had disappeared. I wanted to argue we'd already seen enough to know something was wrong here, but she was determined. "We came here to find answers," she said firmly. "We can't leave now." Alana agreed, though she looked uneasy. "If we're going, we need to be prepared. Whatever's out there isn't afraid of us." We packed extra supplies, flashlights, knives, anything that could be used as a weapon, and set off toward an old logging camp that Mark had found on a map. It was about 3 miles from Black Hollow, tucked away in a part of the forest that hadn't been touched in decades. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The others noticed. It too. I could see it in the way they kept glancing over their shoulders. "Stay close," Elena said quietly. "Don't wander off." About halfway to the logging camp, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. A pile of bones scattered across the trail. They looked like they belonged to deer or elk, but they were stripped clean. No meat, no fur, just bones. "Whatever did this wasn't hunting for food," Elena said grimly. Mark crouched down to examine them more closely. "These aren't fresh," he said after a moment, "but they're not old either. Maybe a few weeks." Sam took out his camera and started snapping pictures. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. We kept moving, but the tension in the group was growing with every step. The forest felt alive now, not in the way nature usually does, but in a way that made it seem like it was watching us. When we finally reached the logging camp, it was worse than I'd imagined. The buildings were little more than rotting wooden shells, their roofs caved in and their walls covered in moss and vines. Tools and machinery lay scattered around, rusted and broken. "This place hasn't been touched in years," Mark said as he looked around. Catherine pointed toward one of the buildings, a small cabin near the edge of the clearing. "Let's start there," she said. As we approached the cabin, I noticed something strange. Claw marks on the door frame. They were deep and jagged, like something had tried to tear its way inside. Elena pushed open the door slowly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. The cabin was empty except for an old table and chair covered in dust. But there was something else, a smell that made my stomach turn. It was sharp and metallic, like blood mixed with decay. "What is that?" Sam asked, covering his nose. "Don't know," Elena replied softly, "but it's fresh." Suddenly, we heard it again, the low growl from the night before. It echoed through the trees outside, louder this time and closer. "They're here," Catherine whispered. Before anyone could respond, something slammed against the side of the cabin with enough force to shake it. We all froze as another growl sounded from behind us, and then another from somewhere else. "They're surrounding us again," Elena said urgently. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, something crashed through one of the cabin's windows, a large, shadowy figure that moved too fast for me to see clearly. It didn't attack. It just stood there for a moment before disappearing back into the trees. "They're playing with us," Mark said shakily. For the first time since we arrived in Pine Ridge, I felt real fear. Not just unease or tension, but fear so strong it made my hands shake. "We can't stay here," Elena said firmly. "Move, now!" We ran out of the cabin and into the forest without looking back. The growls followed us as we stumbled through the trees, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to keep moving. We didn't stop running until we were sure the growls had faded into the distance. The forest was still dark, but the silence that followed was almost worse. My chest burned from running, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. We huddled together in a small clearing, trying to catch our breath. "Is everyone okay?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Sam said, though he looked pale and shaken. "What were those things?" No one answered. I didn't think any of us wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew. Whatever was out there wasn't normal. It wasn't something we could explain or prepare for. "We can't stay out here," Elena said finally. "We need to find shelter." "There's an old ranger station about a mile from here," Mark said. He pulled out his map and pointed to a spot just north of our location. "It's abandoned, but it should still be standing." "Let's go," Catherine said without hesitation. The walk to the ranger station was tense and quiet. Every sound made us jump. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again. But the forest stayed empty. at least for now. When we reached the station, it was clear no one had been there in years. The building was small and run down with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. But it was better than nothing. Elena pushed open the door cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the room. Inside, it was dusty and cluttered with old furniture and equipment, but there were no signs of recent activity. "This will do," she said, closing the door behind us. We barricaded the entrance with whatever we could find: chairs, a broken table, even an old filing cabinet. It wasn't much, but it made us feel a little safer. As we sat in the dim light of our flashlights, Catherine pulled out her notebook and started writing furiously. "We need to document everything," she said. "Every detail could be important." "What's the point?" Sam asked bitterly. "No one's going to believe us." "They will if we make it out of here," Catherine replied firmly. Mark sat by the window, peering through a crack in the boards. "I don't think they're gone," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked. He turned to look at me, his face pale in the faint light. "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Sam asked nervously. "For us to make a mistake," Mark replied. The hours dragged on as we sat in that tiny station, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. At first, there was nothing, just the occasional creak of wood or rustle of leaves, but then came the growls again. Low and distant at first, but growing louder as the night went on. "They're getting closer," Elena said grimly. I felt my stomach twist as I realized she was right. The growls weren't random anymore. They were deliberate, circling us like predators stalking their prey. "We need a plan," Catherine said urgently. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come." Elena nodded. "If they're hunting us, we need to turn the tables." "What are you suggesting?" I asked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "We need to fight back." Sam looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Fight back? Against those things? Are you insane?" "It's either that or wait here until they pick us off one by one," she shot back. "She's right," Catherine said after a moment. "We can't stay here forever." Mark pulled out his map again and pointed to another location, a cave system about 2 miles from the station. "If we can make it there, we might be able to trap them inside." "That's a big if," I said uneasily. "It's better than nothing," Elena replied firmly. We spent the next hour gathering supplies and preparing for what felt like an impossible task. We made torches from scraps of wood and cloth, sharpened sticks into makeshift spears, and packed whatever food and water we had left. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be our last night alive. We set out for the caves, just before dawn, hoping the faint light would give us an advantage. The forest was still and quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We moved quickly but carefully, staying close together and keeping our makeshift weapons ready. Elena led the way, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Catherine was right behind her, clutching a torch in one hand and her notebook in the other. Sam and Mark followed, their faces tense and pale. I brought up the rear, constantly glancing over my shoulder to make sure we weren't being followed. The first mile was uneventful, but the closer we got to the caves, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, something unnatural. The whispering started again, faint at first but growing louder with every step. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the forest itself was alive. "Keep moving," Elena said sharply. "Don't stop." We pushed forward, our footsteps crunching against the dry leaves and twigs on the ground. The whispering grew, louder until it felt like it was right in our ears. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, crawling under my skin and into my mind. Suddenly, Sam stopped and turned around, his flashlight shaking, in his hand. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" Catherine asked. "Footsteps," he said nervously, "behind us." We all froze and listened. At first there was nothing, just the whispering. But then I heard it too, soft, deliberate, footsteps coming from somewhere in the darkness. "They're here," Elena said quietly. Before anyone could respond, a shadow darted between the trees ahead of us. It was fast, too fast for me to see clearly, but it was big, much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. "Run!" Elena shouted. We broke into a sprint, crashing through the underbrush as more shadows appeared around us. They moved like predators, silent and swift, closing in from all sides. The growls started again, low and guttural, vibrating through the air like a warning. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was focus on putting one foot in front of the other and hope we'd make it to the caves in time. But then I heard a scream, Sam's voice, sharp and terrified. I turned just in time to see him fall to the ground as one of the creatures lunged at him from behind. It was massive, covered in dark fur with glowing eyes that burned like fire. Its claws tore into him before he could even react. "Sam!" Catherine screamed. Elena grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. "We can't stop. We have to keep moving." I wanted to help him. I wanted to do something. But there was no time. The creatures were everywhere now, their glowing eyes surrounding us like a ring of fire. Mark stumbled as another creature lunged at him from the side. He swung his torch wildly, managing to drive it back for a moment before it disappeared into the shadows again. "Keep going," Elena shouted. We ran harder than we ever had before, our lungs burning and our legs screaming for rest. The caves were just ahead now. I could see their dark openings cutting into the hillside like jagged mouths. "Almost there," Elena yelled. But just as we reached the entrance, one of the creatures appeared directly in front of us. It stood, on two legs like a man but moved like an animal, its body hunched and twisted, its glowing eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Elena didn't hesitate. She charged at it with her spear raised high. The creature snarled and swiped at her with its claws, but she dodged and drove her weapon straight into its chest. It let out a horrible screech before collapsing to the ground. "Hurry!" she shouted as she turned back toward us. We scrambled into the caves one by one, our hearts pounding as we squeezed through narrow tunnels and climbed over jagged rocks. The creatures didn't follow. Not yet, but their growls echoed outside like thunder rolling through the forest. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Catherine collapsed against a rock wall and started sobbing quietly. "Sam's gone," she whispered. No one said anything. We didn't need to. We all knew what had happened, and we all knew there was no going back now. The caves were cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and mildew. We huddled together in one of the larger chambers, our flashlights casting long, shaky shadows on the walls. No one spoke for a long time. The weight of what had just happened, what we had seen, was too much to process. Catherine sat with her back against the wall, staring blankly at the ground. Her notebook was still clutched in her hands, but she wasn't writing anymore. Mark paced back and forth near the entrance, his flashlight flickering as he muttered to himself. Elena was the only one who seemed composed, though I could see the tension in her jaw and the way her hands gripped her spear tightly. I sat near Catherine, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, replaying Sam's scream over and over again. I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes or the sound of claws tearing into flesh. It felt unreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "We can't stay here forever," Elena said finally, breaking the silence. "Where are we supposed to go?" Mark snapped. "Out there, with them. They'll come for us eventually," she replied calmly. "We need to be ready." "Ready for what?" Catherine asked softly. "To die?" Elena didn't answer. The whispering started again, not long after that. At first, I thought it was just in my head, an echo of what we'd heard in the forest. But then I saw Catherine look up sharply, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all nodded. The whispering was faint but unmistakable, like voices carried on a breeze that didn't exist. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the cave walls and filling the air around us. "They're trying to mess with us," Elena said firmly. "Ignore it." But it wasn't just the whispering. As we sat there in the dark, strange things started happening, things that didn't make sense. Mark's flashlight flickered and died, even though he'd just put fresh batteries in it. Catherine's notebook suddenly slipped from her hands and fell open on the ground, its pages flipping wildly as if caught in a strong wind. But there was no wind, and then there were the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, our flashlights casting strange shapes on the walls. But then I realized they were moving, even when we weren't. Dark shapes danced along the edges of our vision, shifting and twisting like they were alive. "Do you see that?" I asked quietly. Elena nodded grimly. "They're trying to scare us." "Well, it's working," Mark muttered. The shadows grew bolder as time went on, creeping closer and closer until it felt like they were right on top of us. Every time I turned my head, I thought I saw something. A figure standing just out of reach or a pair of glowing eyes, watching from the darkness, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. "They're not real," Elena said firmly. "They're just illusions." "How do you know that?" Catherine asked shakily. "I don't," she admitted. "But if they wanted to kill us, they would have done it by now." Her words didn't bring much comfort. At some point, Mark snapped. He stood up suddenly and started shouting into the darkness. "What do you want from us?" he yelled. "Why are you doing this?" "Mark, stop," Elena hissed. But he didn't listen. He kept shouting, his voice echoing through the caves until it felt like the walls were closing in around us. And then everything went silent. The whispering stopped. The shadows froze, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had paused. That's when we heard it. A voice. Not a growl or a whisper, but an actual voice. Deep and distorted like it was coming from somewhere far away. "You don't belong here." The words sent a chill down my spine. They weren't loud, they didn't need to be, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten and my breath catch in my throat. Mark stumbled backward, his face pale as a sheet. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all nodded. Think they're warning us," Catherine said quietly. "Or taunting us," Elena replied grimly. Either way, it was clear we weren't safe, not here and not anywhere else in this cursed forest. The voice didn't speak again, but the damage was done. We were all shaken, and the silence that followed felt heavier than ever. Mark sat down against the wall, his head in his hands, while Catherine clutched her notebook like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Elena paced back and forth, her spear gripped tightly in one hand. I tried to think, tried to focus, but my mind was a mess. "We can't stay here," Elena said finally, breaking the silence. "They're playing with us, wearing us down. If we don't do something, we're not going to make it." "What do you suggest?" Catherine asked weakly. Elena stopped pacing and looked at each of us in turn. "We need to fight back." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Fight back? Against them? Did you see what they did to Sam? We don't stand a chance." "We don't have a choice," she replied firmly. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." "How?" I asked quietly. "How do we fight something like this?" Elena hesitated for a moment before answering. "They're hunting us, right? Stalking us like predators. But predators can be outsmarted." "What are you saying?" Catherine asked. "I'm saying we need to turn the tables," Elena said. "We need to lure them into a trap." Mark shook his head. "That's suicide. It's better than doing nothing," she shot back. I thought about it for a moment, and despite the fear clawing at my chest, I realized she was right. We couldn't just sit here and wait for those creatures to pick us off one by one. We had to do something, anything to take control of the situation. "Okay," I said finally. "What's the plan?" Elena took a deep breath and pointed toward the map Mark had laid out earlier. "The cave system has another entrance on the far side," she explained. If we can lure them inside and block off one of the exits, we might be able to trap them." "And then what?" Mark asked skeptically. "Then we figure out how to deal with them," she replied. "It's risky," Catherine said quietly. "Everything about this is risky," Elena replied. "But it's our best shot." We spent the next hour preparing for what felt like an impossible task. Elena took charge, organizing our supplies and assigning roles to each of us. Mark would stay near the main entrance with Catherine, ready to seal it off once the creatures were inside. I would help Elena lead them into the trap, using torches and noise to draw their attention. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be our last night alive. Every sound outside the caves made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was watching us. When everything was ready, Elena turned to face us, her expression serious but calm. "This isn't going to be easy," she said. "But if we stick together and stay focused, we can do this." Mark didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. Catherine gave a small nod too, though her hands were trembling as she held her torch. "Let's move," Elena said. We made our way through the caves, slowly and carefully, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls around us. The whispering had started again, faint but persistent, like it was trying to distract us from what we were doing. When we reached the far entrance of the cave system, Elena stopped and turned to me. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. She lit her torch and held it high, its flickering light cutting through the darkness ahead of us. Then she let out a loud shout that echoed through the caves like thunder. For a moment there was nothing, just silence and darkness. But then came the growls. Low at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "They're coming," Elena said grimly. The growls grew louder, echoing through the caves like a storm rolling in. My grip tightened around the torch as I stood beside Elena, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The flickering light of our torches barely cut through, the darkness ahead, and every shadow seemed alive, twisting and shifting as if it were watching us. "They're close," Elena whispered. "Stay sharp." I nodded, swallowing hard to keep the fear from overwhelming me. This was it, the moment we'd been dreading and preparing for. There was no turning back now. Suddenly, movement. A dark shape darted across the tunnel ahead of us, too fast to see clearly but big enough to make my stomach drop. Then another shape, closer this time, followed by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. "They're here," Elena said firmly. "Get ready." I raised my torch higher, trying to keep my hands steady as I scanned the darkness for any sign of the creatures. The growls were coming from all directions now, bouncing off the cave walls and making it impossible to tell where. They were, and then I saw them. Glowing eyes appeared in the shadows ahead. 2 at first, then 4, then 6. They moved closer slowly, their shapes becoming clearer in the flickering light of our torches. They were massive, covered in dark fur with twisted limbs that looked almost human but weren't. Their claws gleamed in the light, sharp and deadly. Elena didn't hesitate. She shouted again, waving her torch wildly to draw their attention. "Come on!" she yelled. "Follow us!" The creatures snarled and lunged forward, their movements fast and predatory. I turned and ran after Elena, my torch, lighting the way as we sprinted deeper into the caves. The sound of claws scraping against stone filled the air behind us, growing louder with every step. "Keep moving," Elena shouted over her shoulder. We led them through narrow tunnels and twisting paths, deeper and deeper into the cave system, until we reached the chamber we'd chosen for the trap. It was a wide space with high ceilings and only 2 exits, one on each side. Elena stopped suddenly and turned to face me. "This is it," she said. "Get ready." I nodded and took my position near one of the exits while Elena stood near the other. The creatures were close now. I could hear their growls echoing through the tunnels as they approached, and then they were there. They burst into the chamber like a wave of darkness, their glowing eyes fixed on us as they snarled and snapped their jaws. There were more of them than I'd expected, at least 10, and they moved with a terrifying speed and coordination that made my blood run cold. Elena shouted again, waving her torch to keep them focused on her. "Now!" she yelled. I grabbed a pile of rocks we'd prepared earlier and started throwing them toward one of the exits, creating a loud noise that echoed through the chamber. The creatures hesitated for a moment before turning toward me, their glowing eyes narrowing as they snarled. "Come on!" I shouted, throwing another rock to keep their attention. It worked. They started moving toward me slowly, their claws scraping against the stone floor as they advanced. Meanwhile, Elena was doing the same thing on her side of the chamber, drawing some of the creatures toward her with loud shouts and wild movements. It was dangerous, too dangerous, but it was working. As soon as most of them were inside the chamber, Catherine and Mark appeared at one of the exits with a pile of debris they'd gathered earlier, rocks, broken wood, anything they could find, and started sealing it off as quickly as they could. "Hurry!" Elena shouted. The creatures realized what was happening too late. By the time they turned toward Catherine and Mark, most of them were trapped inside the chamber with us, but not all of them. 2 creatures lunged toward Catherine and Mark before they could finish sealing off the exit. Mark swung his torch wildly, managing to drive one back for a moment before it swiped at him with its claws, knocking him to the ground. "Catherine!" I shouted. She turned just in time to see one of the creatures lunging at her. She screamed and swung her torch desperately, hitting it square in the face and driving it back into the shadows. Elena charged forward with her spear raised high, shouting as she stabbed one of the creatures in its side. It let out a horrible screech before collapsing to the ground. The remaining creatures snarled and lunged toward us again, their glowing eyes burning with rage. But we held our ground, swinging torches and throwing rocks until finally, they retreated into the shadows. For a moment there was silence, just heavy breathing and flickering torchlight, but then came another sound, growls echoing from deeper within the caves. "They're regrouping," Elena said grimly. "We need to move." We didn't stop running until we were out of the caves and back in the forest. The first rays of sunlight were breaking through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It should have felt safe, comforting even, but it didn't. The forest was still too quiet, too heavy, like it was holding its breath. Mark was limping, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Catherine looked like she was barely holding herself together, her hands trembling as she clutched her notebook. Elena led the way, her spear still clenched tightly in her hand, though her movements were slower now, more cautious. I brought up the rear, my torch burned down to a stub but still flickering faintly. My chest ached from running, and my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. "We need to get back to camp," Elena said quietly. "Pack up and leave." "No," Catherine said suddenly, her voice sharp and desperate. "We can't leave. Not yet." Elena turned to face her, her expression hard. "What are you talking about? We barely made it out alive." "We came here for answers," Catherine replied, her voice trembling but determined. "We can't leave without them." "What answers?" Mark snapped. "We already know what's out here. It's death." Catherine shook her head. "There's more to this. Those creatures, they're not just hunting us. They're protecting something." Elena frowned. "Protecting what?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "But I think it has something to do with that ice formation we saw at Black Hollow." I felt a chill run down my spine at the mention of the ice. I hadn't thought about it since we left that clearing, but now that she brought it up, I realized she might be right. "It's too dangerous," Elena said firmly. "We need to leave while we still can." "You can leave," Catherine said quietly. "But I'm staying." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "You're insane." "No," Catherine replied softly. "I'm just tired of running." Elena stared at her for a long moment before finally sighing and shaking her head. "Fine," she said reluctantly. "But if we're doing this, we do it together." Mark groaned in frustration but didn't argue. We made our way back toward Black Hollow slowly and carefully, our nerves stretched thin as we scanned the forest for any sign of movement. The whispering had stopped, for now, but the heavy feeling in the air hadn't gone away. When we reached the clearing, the ice formation was still there, glistening in the sunlight like frozen shards of glass. It looked even more unnatural, now than it had before, out of place in a way that made my skin crawl. "What is it?" Elena asked quietly. "I don't know," Catherine replied as she stepped closer to examine it. "Be careful," Mark warned. Catherine crouched down near one of the spikes and reached out hesitantly to touch it. As soon as her fingers brushed against the surface, she gasped and pulled back sharply. "What is it?" I asked. "It's warm," she said, her voice filled with confusion. "It shouldn't be warm." Elena frowned and stepped closer to examine the ice herself. She didn't touch it, but leaned in carefully, her eyes narrowing as she studied its surface. "It's not just ice," she said after a moment. "There's something inside it." "What do you mean?" Mark asked nervously. Helena pointed toward one of the larger spikes where faint shapes seemed to swirl beneath the surface, dark and indistinct but unmistakably alive. "They're trapped," Catherine whispered. "Trapped?" I repeated, my stomach twisting with unease. She nodded slowly. "I think this is why those creatures are here. To protect this. Whatever this is." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane." Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed through the clearing. The same growl we'd heard before, but louder this time and closer. "They're here," Elena said urgently. "We need to move, now." But before we could run, the creatures appeared again, glowing eyes emerging from the shadows all around us. "They won't let us leave," Catherine whispered. Elena raised her spear and shouted at us to run, but I knew it was too late. The creatures had us surrounded. For a moment, everything froze. The creatures stood still, their glowing eyes fixed on us as if waiting for something. And then I heard it again, the voice from the caves, deep and distorted, but unmistakable. "You don't belong here." The words sent a chill through me so strong I thought I might collapse. The creatures didn't attack. They just stood there, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, Elena lowered her spear and took a step back toward the edge of the clearing. "Let's go," she said quietly. No one argued. We just turned and walked away slowly, our hearts pounding as we left Black Hollow behind. When we finally made it back to camp, no one spoke. We just packed up our gear in silence and started walking toward the edge of the forest. As we reached the tree line and stepped into open sunlight for the first time in days, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that whatever was out there wasn't done with us yet.